You ever hear about people going mad in their own heads, like their thoughts just aren't theirs anymore? That's what happened to Lisa. She lived alone in this small, creaky house on the edge of town. No kids, no husband, just her and her routines: water her plants, feed her cat, and spend quiet evenings reading. But then one night, while brushing her teeth, she heard it. A whisper. Faint, like someone was standing right behind her. She turned, but of course, no one was there. At first, Lisa thought it was just her imagination. Maybe she was overtired. You know how your brain plays tricks on you when you're stressed. But the whispers didn't stop. They weren't random either. They started saying things, small things at first. Like, don't forget to lock the door, or you should check the stove. Helpful stuff. Lisa even thought they might have been her subconscious, reminding her of things she needed to do. It was weird, but harmless. Or so she thought. But then, one day, the voice wasn't helpful anymore. She was making tea, and out of nowhere, it said, "The knife." That's all. Just those two words, the knife. Lisa froze. She tried to brush it off, told herself she was being silly, but something about the tone was different. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a demand. Lisa started avoiding the kitchen after that. She told herself she was being paranoid, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The voice wasn't going away. It started showing up in other places too, when she was in bed, when she was folding laundry, even in the middle of her walks. And it wasn't just whispering anymore. Sometimes, it laughed. A low, raspy chuckle that sent chills down her spine. One night, as Lisa sat in her living room trying to watch TV, the voice said something that made her heart stop. "Let me in," it hissed. Lisa turned off the TV and sat in silence, staring at the dark window across the room. She tried to convince herself it was the wind or the house settling, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." It wasn't coming from outside, it was in her head. And it wasn't asking anymore. It was commanding. Desperate for answers, Lisa started Googling. She read about auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia, and even possession. None of it made sense. She'd always been healthy, mentally and physically. But the more she searched, the more she started to wonder, was this a sickness? Or was something darker at play? By the third week, Lisa was exhausted. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. The voice was constant now, filling every quiet moment with its demands. "Break the mirror," it whispered one morning. "Burn the book," it said the next evening. And then, late one night, it said something that made her stomach turn: "Hurt the cat." Lisa snapped. She screamed at the voice to leave her alone, her hands shaking as she clutched her head. But the voice just laughed, mocking her. "You can't get rid of me," it said. "I'm part of you." Those words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. Part of her? What did that even mean? She couldn't accept that this was her reality now, but she didn't know what to do. She tried reaching out for help. Lisa called her sister, Karen, who lived in another state. Karen was practical, no nonsense, and exactly what Lisa thought she needed. But when she tried to explain, Karen brushed it off. "It's just stress," she said. "You've been alone too long. Maybe you need to get out more." Lisa didn't have the energy to argue. Deep down, she knew Karen was wrong. This wasn't stress. This was something else. Something worse. Lisa decided to see a doctor. She sat in the sterile, white office and explained everything to the psychiatrist, trying not to sound completely unhinged. The doctor listened, nodding thoughtfully, and eventually prescribed her some medication. Antipsychotics, he called them. Lisa wasn't thrilled about the idea, but she was desperate for anything that might make the voice go away. For a few days, the pills seemed to work. The voice faded, and Lisa started to feel like herself again. She even managed to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. But then, just when she thought she was finally free, the voice came back. Louder. Angrier. "You think you can drug me away?" it growled. "You're mine, Lisa. You've always been mine." Lisa stopped taking the pills after that. What was the point? If the voice wasn't going anywhere, why numb herself to it? But the truth was, she was scared. More scared than she'd ever been in her life. Because if the pills didn't work, what would? Lisa stopped leaving her house altogether. The outside world felt too overwhelming, too chaotic. Every sound, every shadow felt like it could trigger the voice. So she stayed inside, locking all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains, and avoiding mirrors. The voice loved mirrors. "Look at me," it would say whenever she passed one. "I'm right here, Lisa. Don't you want to see?" One night, the power went out during a storm. Lisa lit candles and tried to stay calm, but the voice was relentless. "You can't hide from me," it whispered, echoing in her mind. "I'll always find you." The candlelight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a brief moment, Lisa thought she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. Her heart raced as she stared, unblinking, but when the light steadied, the figure was gone. Lisa knew she was losing it. She couldn't trust her own eyes, her own ears, or even her own thoughts anymore. She sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, clutching her head as the voice screamed at her. "Let me out," it roared, over and over, until it was all she could hear. She wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The next day, Lisa decided to dig deeper. She pulled out an old box of family photos and documents, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening to her. Among the papers, she found a journal that had belonged to her mother. Lisa's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Her mother had written about hearing voices too, but she'd always dismissed them as stress or fatigue. Then Lisa found something chilling, a passage about a woman in their family who'd lived generations ago. The woman had been accused of witchcraft and executed in the 1700s. According to the journal, she'd cursed her own bloodline, vowing to never let her descendants live in peace. Lisa's stomach turned as she read the words. Was this curse real? Was she just another victim of it? The voice seemed to grow stronger after that discovery, as if it knew she'd found the truth. "You can't fight me," it said, almost gleeful. "You're mine, just like she was. Just like they all were." Lisa tried to shut the journal, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She felt trapped by her history, her mind, and whatever this thing was that had latched onto her. Lisa decided to try something she'd never believed in before, an exorcism. She found a local priest, Father Marcus, who seemed skeptical but agreed to help. "If you believe this is spiritual, then prayer might bring you peace," he said. Lisa wasn't sure she believed in anything anymore, but she was willing to try. The night of the exorcism was terrifying. Father Marcus prayed over Lisa, sprinkling holy water and reciting scripture. At first, nothing happened. Lisa felt silly, sitting there in her dark living room with a priest waving a crucifix at her. But then, the air grew cold, so cold that her breath came out in visible puffs. The voice roared inside her head, louder than ever before. "Get him out of here," it screamed. "He can't help you." Lisa started convulsing, her body writhing against her will. Father Marcus tried to hold her steady, but she knocked the crucifix out of his hand. The moment it hit the floor, everything went silent. The voice was gone. Lisa sat up, gasping for air, and looked at Father Marcus. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. Lisa realized something was wrong. Father Marcus backed away from her slowly, clutching his crucifix like it was the only thing keeping him safe. "What's wrong?" she asked, but her voice sounded different, deeper, more guttural. She touched her throat, panic rising. "Father, what's happening to me?" "You need help beyond my power," he said, his voice shaking. He grabbed his bag and fled, leaving Lisa alone in the dark. She felt a strange sensation spreading through her body, like her skin didn't fit anymore. The voice returned, laughing softly. "Did you really think he could save you?" it said. "You belong to me now." Lisa didn't sleep that night. She sat in the middle of her living room, staring at the walls, trying to figure out her next move. But the truth was, she didn't have one. She was out of options, out of hope, and completely at the mercy of whatever had taken over her life. Over the next few days, Lisa felt herself slipping further and further away. The voice wasn't just in her head anymore, it was controlling her actions. She'd find herself standing in the kitchen with a knife in her hand, with no memory of picking it up. Or she'd wake up in the middle of the night, standing in the backyard, barefoot and shivering. Lisa tried to fight it, but the more she resisted, the stronger the voice became. "Stop fighting me," it would say. "It's easier if you just give in." She started to wonder if it was right. What was the point of resisting if she was only making things worse? Maybe it would be easier to let go. One evening, Lisa found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bathroom. The voice was quiet for once, but her reflection wasn't. The woman staring back at her didn't look like her anymore. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, and her lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're not real," Lisa whispered, but the reflection tilted its head and spoke. "Aren't I?" Lisa's final act of defiance came one stormy night. She gathered all her courage and lit a fire in her fireplace. She threw her mother's journal into the flames, watching as the pages curled and turned to ash. The voice screamed in her head, louder than ever, but she ignored it. "You don't control me," she said through gritted teeth. "Not anymore." For a moment, it seemed to work. The voice faded, and Lisa felt a strange sense of relief. But then, the fire went out, snuffed by an unseen force. The room grew colder than ever, and the voice came back, laughing. "You can't get rid of me that easily," it said. "I'm part of you now, forever." Lisa's screams echoed through the empty house, but no one was there to hear them. When the neighbors found her days later, she was sitting in front of the cold fireplace, staring blankly at the ashes. She didn't respond when they called her name. The doctors said she was catatonic, but Lisa knew the truth. She wasn't alone anymore. The voice had finally won. "You know, there's this story I've got to tell you. It's about this woman, Rachel. She lived alone in this old house on the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. At first, it seemed peaceful, a life away from the chaos of the city. She liked the solitude. But, as they say, too much silence can mess with your head. One evening, Rachel heard something strange. A soft whisper, faint and barely there. She thought it was the wind, maybe the house settling, you know? But it kept happening. "Take the umbrella," the voice said once when she was leaving for the store. And, oddly enough, it rained. Another time, it told her to avoid a certain road, and she later found out there'd been an accident there. At first, she laughed it off, even felt grateful for these little gut feelings. But then, the whispers got personal. They knew things she hadn't told anyone, secrets she barely admitted to herself. That's when Rachel started to feel like maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. It wasn't long before the voice stopped being helpful. One night, Rachel was cooking dinner when it spoke again. "Don't use the knife," it said sharply, almost scolding her. She froze, staring at the blade in her hand. The tone was different this time, not guiding, but commanding. She set the knife down, her heart pounding, and finished cooking with trembling hands. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her name being whispered, over and over. "Rachel. Rachel." It wasn't coming from outside. No, it was inside her head, like a thought she couldn't block out. She covered her ears, but that didn't help. The voice laughed, soft and mocking, like it knew her fear. Rachel tried to reason with herself. "This is just stress," she told her reflection in the bathroom mirror. But the voice cut in. "You're lying to yourself, Rachel. You know I'm real." That's when she smashed the mirror with her fist, her own face splintering into 1,000 pieces. She didn't even feel the pain at first, just the cold certainty that she wasn't losing her mind, something else was taking it. After that, Rachel started keeping a journal, trying to track when the voice spoke and what it said. She hoped it might help her figure out if this was some kind of psychological breakdown. But the voice didn't like her writing things down. "Why are you doing that?" it hissed one night as she scribbled in her notebook. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" Rachel slammed the book shut and yelled, "Shut up!" Her own voice echoed in the empty house, but the whisper just laughed again. That laugh, it wasn't loud, but it had a way of crawling under her skin, making her feel like she was being watched even in her own home. She started locking doors, covering windows, and avoiding dark corners. One evening, the voice told her to go outside. "There's something waiting for you," it said, almost sweetly. Rachel refused, curling up on the couch with all the lights on. But the voice wouldn't let up. "Coward," it sneered. "You're too weak to face the truth." That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat there, clutching a kitchen knife, wondering if the voice was right. Rachel decided to see a therapist. She was desperate for answers, hoping someone could tell her she wasn't crazy. Dr. Myers was kind, patient, and asked all the right questions. But every time Rachel opened up about the voice, it felt like the walls in the room were closing in. The voice didn't like being talked about. "You're making a mistake," it warned. Dr. Myers suggested medication, but Rachel was hesitant. What if the pills silenced the voice? She wasn't sure if that was a good thing anymore. Part of her hated it, but another part relied on it. It was like having someone always there, even if that someone was cruel and demanding. She filled the prescription but left the bottle unopened on her bedside table. One night, the voice was louder than ever. "You don't need help," it said, practically shouting now. "You need to listen to me." Rachel clenched her fists, trying to drown it out, but the voice only grew stronger. "If you don't do what I say, you'll regret it," it snarled. That was the first time she felt truly afraid, not of the voice, but of what it might make her do. The next day, Rachel tried to distract herself with chores. She scrubbed the floors, cleaned out the attic, anything to keep her mind busy. But the voice was relentless. "Why are you ignoring me?" it demanded. "You think you can just pretend I'm not here?" She accidentally knocked over a box of old photos in the attic, scattering memories across the dusty floor. Among the photos was one she didn't recognize, a picture of her as a child, standing with a woman who looked eerily familiar. The woman wasn't her mother, though. Rachel couldn't place her face, but it gave her chills. "She's the one," the voice whispered. "She started all of this." Rachel's hands trembled as she held the photo. "Who is she?" she asked aloud, hoping for an answer. But the voice just laughed, leaving her with more questions than ever. That night, she dreamed of the woman, standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with hollow eyes. Rachel woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a drum. The dream felt too real. She could still see the woman's hollow eyes, her silent gaze drilling into her soul. She stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, but the reflection in the mirror stopped her cold. For a moment, it wasn't her face staring back. It was the woman's. She blinked, and her own reflection returned, but she couldn't shake the dread clinging to her. The voice was quiet that morning, which was almost worse than its usual chatter. The silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Rachel tried to go about her day, but every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every creak of the house felt like a warning. By evening, the voice returned, sharper and more commanding than ever. "You need to find her," it said. "She's the key." Rachel gritted her teeth and shouted, "Find who?" The voice chuckled darkly. "The woman from the photo. She's waiting for you, Rachel. Go to her." Rachel knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She dug through the attic, searching for clues, her hands trembling as she flipped through old boxes. Finally, she found a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. It belonged to her grandmother, someone she barely remembered. Inside were pages filled with cryptic notes about rituals, voices, and a woman named Eliza. Eliza was described as a spirit guide, but the tone of the diary changed as the entries went on. What started as gratitude turned to fear. Her grandmother wrote about hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling trapped in her own mind. The final entry was smeared and frantic, "She won't leave me alone. Eliza is not what she seems." The name echoed in Rachel's mind like a curse. The voice chimed in, pleased. "Now you understand," it said. "Eliza has been waiting for you, Rachel. It's time to finish what your grandmother started." Rachel slammed the diary shut, her breath hitching. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she felt it was true. Desperate for answers, Rachel drove to the local library, hoping to find more about her family's past. She sifted through dusty records, piecing together fragments of a story that made her stomach churn. Her grandmother had been involved in some kind of ritual decades ago, one that had gone horribly wrong. The ritual wasn't to summon a guide, it was to bind something dark. The more Rachel read, the more the pieces clicked. Eliza wasn't a guide or a spirit. She was something older, something malevolent. The voice in her head, it wasn't hers. It was Eliza's, trying to break free. The ritual had tethered Eliza to her bloodline, and now, Rachel was her only link to the living world. "Finish it," the voice demanded that night, louder than ever. "You have no choice, Rachel. Set me free." Rachel sat on the floor of her living room, surrounded by candles, the diary open in front of her. She didn't know if she could do it, but the voice was relentless. It was her or Eliza, one of them wouldn't survive this. Rachel followed the instructions in the diary, preparing a counter-ritual to banish Eliza for good. The house felt alive as she worked, floorboards creaked, windows rattled, and shadows danced on the walls. The voice screamed in her head, a deafening roar that made her ears ring. "You don't know what you're doing," it shrieked. But Rachel kept going, her hands shaking as she traced the sigils and muttered the incantations. The air grew colder, and a figure began to form in the corner of the room. It was her, Eliza. The woman from the photo, from her dreams, standing there with those hollow eyes. "Stop this, Rachel," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You don't want to anger me." Rachel's heart raced, but she didn't stop. The candles flickered wildly as she recited the final words of the ritual. Eliza screamed, her form twisting and fading, but not before she hissed, "This isn't over, Rachel. I'll find a way back." Then, the house fell silent. For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt truly alone, and it was both a relief and a terror. She sat in the quiet, staring at the burned-down candles and the smudged sigils on the floor. The voice was gone, but so was the sense of safety she'd once taken for granted. She didn't know if Eliza was truly gone or just waiting for another chance. Rachel moved out of the house a week later, leaving behind everything except the diary. She couldn't bring herself to destroy it, not when it held the only proof of what had happened. But no matter where she went, she felt a shadow lingering, a cold breath on the back of her neck. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, she thought she could hear a faint whisper. "Rachel." You know how sometimes a memory feels more like a shadow? That's how it was for David. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it started, but for as long as he could remember, there was this thing. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a feeling, cold, dark, and heavy. It always crept up on him in quiet moments, like when he was about to fall asleep or when he stood alone in the shower. It became worse when he turned 30. Nightmares started plaguing him. They weren't vivid at first, just flashes, a dark forest, a hollow noise, and the sensation of being watched. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his chest tight, but he could never remember much beyond that. The only thing he knew for certain was the fear. One night, after another dream left him shaking, David tried to trace it back. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at an old photo of himself as a kid, standing in front of his childhood home. What happened? He muttered to no one in particular. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a dream. Something had happened to him, something he'd buried. David started looking into his past, hoping to piece together what he couldn't remember. He called his mom, asking about their old house and what he was like as a kid. Her answers were vague, dismissive. "You had an overactive imagination, that's all," she said. "Always talking about monsters in the woods." But it wasn't just the woods. David remembered fragments, bits of conversation, strange warnings from his dad to stay inside after dark, and the one time he swore he saw something staring at him from the treeline. It was just a dog, his dad had told him back then, but David never believed that. The dreams became more specific after that call. He saw a face, or something like a face. It wasn't human, though. Pale skin stretched too tightly over a gaunt skull, with black, empty eyes. Its mouth moved in the dreams, whispering words he couldn't understand, but he woke up hearing a low, guttural laugh echoing in his ears. The hallucination started not long after. At first, it was harmless, flickers of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to shift when he looked away. Then came the voices. Soft, almost inaudible murmurs, like someone talking just behind a closed door. They didn't say his name, but they felt directed at him, personal. David tried to ignore it, brushing it off as stress or maybe lack of sleep. But one night, he saw it. He was walking home late after work, the street eerily quiet. A movement caught his eye, and when he turned, there it was, standing under a street lamp, its lanky figure impossibly still. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was the thing from his dreams, the same hollow eyes and unnatural grin. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving him questioning if it was ever there to begin with. But he felt it, like a cold hand brushing against his neck, a reminder that it wasn't done with him. The next day, David couldn't shake the feeling. It clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He decided to visit the old neighborhood, the one he grew up in. The house had been torn down years ago, but the woods were still there, thick and looming like a wall of shadows. Standing at the edge of the trees, he felt like a kid again, vulnerable and small. Memories started bubbling up, his dad yelling at him to come inside, his mom locking the doors at sundown, and the strange scratches they'd find on the walls outside in the mornings. He'd always thought they were from animals, but now he wasn't so sure. As he ventured deeper into the woods, that feeling of being watched returned. It was oppressive, making his skin crawl. Then he heard it, a low, guttural laugh, just like in his dreams. David whipped around, but nothing was there. Nothing he could see, at least. The dreams escalated after that. Now, they weren't just dreams, they felt like memories. He saw himself as a child, standing in the woods, staring at the creature. It loomed over him, whispering something. His child self looked terrified, tears streaming down his face. When David woke up, he felt sick. He couldn't eat, couldn't think. The image of that thing lingered in his mind, along with one word he didn't recognize but couldn't shake, Varnoth. He didn't know what it meant, but it repeated in his head like a chant. Desperate, he turned to the internet, searching for anything that could explain what he was experiencing. He found stories, legends of a creature that haunted children, feeding on their fear and returning to them as adults to claim what was left. It wasn't a memory, he realized. It was a curse. David tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that he was just losing his mind. But the evidence was piling up. He started finding scratches on his apartment walls, just like at the old house. Sometimes, his things would be moved, even when he was sure he hadn't touched them. One night, he woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't in his head this time, it was in the room. His heart raced as he reached for the lamp, but the bulb flickered and died. In the darkness, he felt it. A presence. Heavy, suffocating. And then, he saw it. Standing at the foot of his bed, its hollow eyes locked onto his. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared. David froze, paralyzed with fear. When he finally mustered the courage to turn on his phone's flashlight, it was gone, leaving only deep scratches on the floorboards where it had stood. David didn't sleep after that. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined those hollow eyes staring back at him. He spent the night pacing his apartment, trying to make sense of it all. Whatever this thing was, it was real. And it wanted something from him. He decided he couldn't face it alone. He called an old friend, Mike, who dabbled in paranormal investigations as a hobby. It sounds crazy, David said, his voice trembling, but there's something following me. Something I've seen since I was a kid. Mike didn't laugh, which was both comforting and terrifying. I believe you, he said. But if it's what I think it is, you're in real danger. Mike showed up the next evening with equipment, EMF meters, cameras, and some old books filled with stories of ancient entities. If it's tied to your childhood, it might have left a mark, Mike explained. Something that binds it to you. They decided to revisit the woods together, hoping to find answers, or at least some closure. The woods were even darker at night, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Mike led the way, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, while David followed, his nerves frayed. They reached the spot where David had seen the creature as a child, a small clearing surrounded by gnarled trees. Mike set up his equipment, and the EMF meter immediately spiked. "There's something here," he whispered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. David felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the forest itself was watching them. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening chorus. Mike's camera malfunctioned, and the flashlight flickered. And then it appeared, stepping out of the shadows like it had always been there. The creature was taller than David remembered, its gaunt frame twisting unnaturally as it moved. "You can't run from it," Mike said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's already inside you." David froze, every muscle in his body locking up as the creature drew closer. Its mouth moved, but the words weren't audible. It was speaking directly into his mind. Images flooded his brain, the night in the woods as a child, the creature standing over him, and the deal he didn't remember making. "You called me," it said, its voice a low growl in David's mind. "And I came." The memories hit him like a freight train. As a terrified child, he had begged for protection, for someone, or something, to save him from his fears. And the creature had answered, but at a cost. Mike tried to intervene, shouting something David couldn't hear over the creature's voice. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a guttural roar. David could feel his mind unraveling, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring. The creature reached out, its long, clawed hand inches from his face. When David woke up, he was alone in the woods. Mike was gone, and the equipment lay scattered and broken around him. His body ached, and his mind felt like it had been torn apart and stitched back together. But the whispers were gone, and for the first time in weeks, he felt an eerie sense of calm. He stumbled back to his apartment, hoping to piece together what had happened. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw it, the creature's hollow eyes staring back at him. He screamed, smashing the glass, but no matter where he looked, the reflection didn't change. David realized then that the creature hadn't left. It had become a part of him, its voice now his own. The deal he'd made as a child had come full circle. He wasn't the prey anymore. He was the hunter, and the whispers that once haunted him now guided him towards something far darker than he'd ever imagined. You know how sometimes you catch your reflection and get this weird feeling, like it's staring back just a little too intently? That's what happened to Lily. She'd just moved into this old Victorian house on the edge of town, a fresh start after a messy breakup. The place was a little rundown but had charm. Lots of mirrors, though. Every room had at least one, some with ornate frames, others just plain glass. At first, she didn't think much of it. She even liked the mirrors, they gave the place character. But it started small, tiny delays. Like she'd turn her head, and her reflection was just the tiniest bit behind. Not enough to scream paranormal, but enough to make her pause. She laughed it off, told herself she was just overtired from unpacking. But then, one night, she was brushing her teeth and looked up. Her reflection didn't move. Lily froze, the toothbrush midair. For what felt like forever, the image just stared back at her, unblinking. Then, just like that, it mimicked her again, perfectly in sync. She laughed nervously and went to bed, telling herself it was just her imagination. The next morning, she tried to forget about it, but the mirrors were everywhere, She couldn't avoid them even if she wanted to. In the kitchen, she caught her reflection watching her while she made coffee. In the hallway, it seemed off, like the angle of her reflection wasn't quite right. She started testing it, doing quick movements to see if she could catch it again. For a while, it behaved normally. But every now and then, there'd be a flicker, a delay so subtle that she wondered if she was losing it. She called her best friend, Emma, for reassurance. "You're just stressed," Emma said. "Old houses have weird vibes. You're fine." But Lily wasn't convinced. That night, she tried covering the mirrors with sheets. It helped, sort of, but she could feel them underneath, like they were still watching her. Around midnight, she heard a faint tapping. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from the covered mirror in the hallway. She didn't sleep much that night. The tapping eventually stopped, but the unease didn't. The next morning, Lily decided to take the mirror down entirely. It wasn't heavy, but when she pulled it off the wall, she swore she heard a faint whisper. She froze, heart pounding, but when she leaned in, there was nothing. Determined to shake off the fear, she shoved the mirror into the basement. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But as she walked back upstairs, she noticed something odd. The mirror she hadn't covered seemed clearer, sharper, like the glass wasn't just reflecting but watching. That evening, as she washed dishes, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the kitchen window. It wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was smiling. A slow, creeping smile that didn't belong on her face. Lily stumbled back, the dish slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. When she looked again, the reflection was normal, her own face staring back in shock. Lily called Emma again, this time more frantic. "Something's wrong," she said. "I know it sounds crazy, but my reflection, it's not me." Emma hesitated before replying. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she said carefully. "Like a professional." That stung, but Lily couldn't blame her. It did sound insane. She decided to take Emma's advice, at least partially. She booked an appointment with a local therapist, but the earliest opening was 2 weeks away. In the meantime, she was stuck with the mirrors, and whatever was in them. That night, she avoided them as best she could, but the house seemed to have other plans. The tapping returned, louder this time, coming from multiple mirrors. She sat in the living room, paralyzed with fear, as the sound grew more insistent. When she finally mustered the courage to look, she saw it. Her reflection wasn't in sync anymore. It was standing still, staring at her, and its eyes, they weren't hers. Desperation set in. Lily covered every mirror in the house, even the small one in her purse. For a while, it seemed to work. The house felt quieter, less oppressive. But the silence didn't last. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint scratching. It wasn't coming from the mirrors this time. It was coming from inside the walls. She followed the sound to the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then, suddenly, it stopped. She stood there, holding her breath, when the sheet covering the mirror at the end of the hall slipped off on its own. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't copying her anymore. It pressed its hands against the glass, as if trying to push through. Its lips moved, though no sound came out, and then it smiled. Lily ran back to her room and locked the door, her hands trembling. She knew she couldn't stay here much longer. Lily couldn't sleep after that. She stayed up, clutching her phone, trying to find answers online. She searched for anything about haunted mirrors, doppelgangers, or cursed houses. Most of what she found seemed like nonsense, urban legends, ghost stories. But one forum caught her eye. A user had posted about a similar experience, reflections behaving strangely, feeling watched, hearing noises. The thread was old, but the responses were chilling. One reply read, "If the reflection starts acting on its own, leave. Don't try to fight it. Don't let it out." Another warned, "Covering the mirrors won't work forever. They don't need the glass to watch you." That last sentence made Lily's skin crawl. She slammed her laptop shut and sat in the dark, trying to steady her breathing. But then she noticed something on the edge of her vision, a faint shimmer in the corner of the room. She turned slowly, and there it was. Her reflection, standing in the uncovered vanity mirror, grinning. The next morning, Lily decided she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag, planning to leave until she could figure out what to do. But as she walked down the stairs, she felt a strange resistance, like the air had thickened. Every step felt heavier, and the house seemed darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally. When she reached the front door, she stopped cold. Her reflection was in the hallway mirror, standing in front of her with its hand pressed against the glass. But it wasn't mimicking her anymore. It was mouthing words. Lily leaned closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She could just barely make out what it was saying. "Let me in." Terrified, she backed away, but the reflection didn't disappear. Instead, it slammed its hand against the glass, a loud crack echoing through the hallway. The sound snapped Lily out of her trance, and she bolted out the door, not even bothering to lock it behind her. Lily drove aimlessly for hours, too scared to go to a friend's house and drag them into this nightmare. She ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, a dingy place with peeling wallpaper and a single, cracked mirror above the sink. She covered it with a towel before collapsing onto the bed. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of safety. But as the night dragged on, the familiar tapping returned. It wasn't coming from the motel mirror, it was coming from her phone. She picked it up, and the screen lit up with a notification. It was a photo of her. Not from her camera roll, but taken in real time. She was sitting on the bed, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. In the background, she could see the towel she'd placed over the mirror, now lying on the floor. Lily didn't stay to find out what was in the mirror. She grabbed her things and left the motel, driving until the sun rose. She ended up at a library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. In the dusty archives, she stumbled across an old article about her house. It turned out the previous owner, a woman named Margaret, had died under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors reported hearing her scream in the middle of the night, but when the police arrived, the house was empty. The only clue was a shattered mirror in the living room, covered in bloody handprints on the inside of the glass. Lily's stomach turned as she read. The article mentioned that Margaret had complained about something in the mirrors in the weeks leading up to her death. The librarian noticed Lily's pale face and asked if she was okay. Lily just nodded, too shaken to speak. By the time Lily got back to the house, she had a plan. She was going to destroy every mirror, no matter what it took. Armed with a hammer, she started in the hallway, shattering the glass with a single swing. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, she thought she saw something dart out of the broken shards. She moved from room to room, smashing every mirror until only one remained, the antique mirror she'd shoved into the basement. With trembling hands, she descended the creaking stairs, feeling the air grow colder with each step. The mirror was waiting for her, its surface unnaturally smooth, like it was alive. When she raised the hammer, her reflection moved. But instead of copying her, it stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. A voice echoed in her mind, soft and chilling. "If you break me, you break yourself." Lily hesitated, the hammer trembling in her grip. And then, with a terrible grin, her reflection whispered, "Too late." The hammer slipped from her hands, and the last thing Lily saw was her reflection reaching out, pulling her into the cold, endless void of the mirror. When the police arrived days later, the house was empty. The only thing they found was a single, untouched mirror, its surface perfectly smooth, except for a faint handprint on the inside. It all started a few months ago when Michael first began to feel a strange weight on his shoulders. It wasn't anything obvious, just a constant pressure that seemed to come out of nowhere. At first, he thought it was stress, maybe from work or some personal issue, but the feeling never went away. It was as if something heavy had settled on him, always there, always pressing down. He went to see a doctor, who shrugged it off as psychosomatic, just his mind playing tricks on him. "Stress can manifest physically," the doctor said. "It'll pass." But it didn't. The pressure began to intensify. It was subtle at first, like an uncomfortable weight. Then, it started to feel like something was actually sitting on his shoulders, its presence undeniable. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't just a sensation, it felt real. He could even feel the shift when it moved slightly, as if it was adjusting itself. He'd wake up some mornings feeling like it had moved to a different part of his back, or worse, like it was creeping closer to his neck. His muscles tensed, and his anxiety grew. Michael tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It wasn't just the physical discomfort anymore. He started feeling irritable, like his thoughts were clouded, and his actions weren't fully his own. He found himself snapping at people over trivial things, or staring blankly at nothing for long stretches. Something was wrong, and no matter how many doctors he visited, no one could explain it. A few weeks passed, and the pressure grew stronger. Michael had become obsessed with the sensation. He'd find himself standing in front of mirrors, staring at his reflection, almost waiting for something to appear behind him. But there was nothing. His reflection was just him, tired eyes, unkempt hair, and a posture that seemed to sag more each day. But in those moments, he swore he could feel it, a presence just behind him. Watching. It wasn't until he was walking home from work one night that he noticed something strange. The pressure on his shoulders had moved. It was subtle, but there was a difference in the weight, like it had shifted lower down his back, pressing into his spine. His legs felt heavy, as though they weren't his own. He stumbled, catching himself on a nearby streetlight. That's when he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, as though it was right next to his ear. "Let me in." His heart raced, and the sensation on his shoulders shifted again, this time almost choking him. He gasped for air, feeling as though he couldn't breathe. The pressure was so overwhelming that he thought he might collapse right there on the sidewalk. He reached for his phone, desperate to call for help, but when he looked up, everything was still. No one had noticed, no one had heard. It was as if the world had turned a blind eye to him, but he knew it was real. It wasn't just in his mind. The days that followed were a blur. The pressure on his shoulders never left, but now it seemed to have a life of its own. It would move, almost purposefully, around his back, his neck, and even his chest, squeezing him tighter when he least expected it. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was attached to him, something that wasn't part of his own body. Michael tried to talk to his closest friend, John, about what was happening. But John laughed it off, dismissing it as stress. "Man, you've been working too much. Just relax." But Michael couldn't relax. He felt it even when he tried to sleep. It was always there, always watching, pressing down harder and harder each day. And then, one evening, it started to speak again. This time, the voice was clearer. Louder. "You can't escape." It wasn't his voice, but it sounded familiar, like a twisted version of his own thoughts. Michael's hands trembled as he grabbed his head, trying to drown out the noise, but it only intensified. The pressure became unbearable, like something was suffocating him from the inside. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like the weight was trying to pull him into the ground, drag him into some dark, unseen abyss. Michael didn't know how long he could take it anymore. He spent most nights awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced that something was moving around him. His body was aching, drained of energy, but still, he couldn't sleep. He could feel the weight of it shifting, like it was preparing for something. Every time he looked in the mirror, he felt as though he was being watched, not by his reflection, but by something behind it. Something that shouldn't be there. One morning, as he was leaving for work, he stopped in front of the mirror, staring at his own image. The reflection seemed off, like his eyes weren't quite in sync with his movements. Then, the pressure on his shoulders intensified, so much that he gasped for air. His reflection smirked. It wasn't his expression. It was wrong. Frozen in place, Michael's heart raced as he saw his reflection slowly reach up, as if it were trying to touch him. He took a step back, and for a split second, his reflection did the same. But then, it didn't stop. It lunged forward, pressing its face against the glass. Michael stumbled back, feeling a chill run down his spine. "It's you," the voice whispered again, but now it sounded like a warning. "You can't get rid of me." Desperation set in. Michael couldn't live like this anymore. The doctors had dismissed him as mentally unstable, but he knew there was something more to it. This wasn't just stress, this wasn't just his mind. Something was changing him, something else was influencing his every move. The pressure, the whispers, they were becoming more than just a symptom of stress. They were real. He decided to confront whatever this was head-on. That night, he stayed up, waiting for the pressure to become unbearable. It didn't take long. The weight on his shoulders was almost crushing him. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, desperate to cut away whatever this was. He believed that if he could just make the pain stop, everything would go back to normal. But when he raised the knife, the pressure shifted again. This time, it felt like something was holding his hand back. Michael screamed, feeling the air grow cold around him. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice cracking. But the weight pressed down even harder. The whisper came again, louder now, and it wasn't just in his ear, it was in his head, a constant voice repeating the same words. "You belong to me now." Part 6. The days blurred together as Michael spiraled deeper into the grip of whatever was controlling him. His body grew weaker, his thoughts disjointed. He no longer trusted his own reflection or his own senses. When he looked in the mirror, his face seemed unfamiliar. The pressure was always there, even when he thought he could escape it. The whispers were constant now, like a chant. One evening, as he sat in his living room, the pressure seemed to reach a new peak. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell to the floor, gasping for air. He could barely breathe, the weight of it suffocating him. And then, he heard a voice, clear as day. "Come to me." He didn't know if he was hearing it in his mind, or if it was real. But in that moment, he felt something cold and sharp against his skin, like fingers brushing against his spine. He twisted around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space. But the pressure wasn't gone. It was worse than ever. Part 7. By now, Michael had become a shell of the person he once was. His friends and family stopped calling, worried about his strange behavior, but they couldn't understand. No one could. He was haunted, trapped in his own skin, the weight of something unseen and malicious pressing down on him at all hours. It controlled his every move. He couldn't leave the house, couldn't bring himself to eat or sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, the pressure would return, relentless, suffocating. And sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he would swear that he saw something else, a shadowy figure standing just behind him, invisible to everyone but him. One night, he sat in front of the mirror again, waiting for something to happen. The pressure on his back was unbearable now. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he saw the reflection wasn't him. It was something else, something dark, something that had been with him from the beginning. And it was smiling. Part 8. Michael knew he couldn't escape. Whatever this was, it had him. The whispers had stopped, at least, in his mind. But now, the pressure was all-consuming, wrapping around him like chains, squeezing tighter with every passing hour. He couldn't move, couldn't think. All he could do was exist beneath its weight. In his final moments, he reached out toward the mirror one last time, his fingers trembling. As he touched the glass, the pressure vanished. For a brief moment, he felt free. But when he looked up, his reflection didn't look like him anymore. It was smiling. It started with the mirrors. At first, it was subtle. Sophie would catch glimpses of herself in the reflection, but something felt off. It wasn't like a change in appearance, not at all. It was more like she was looking at someone else entirely. It wasn't a stranger, but it wasn't her either. It was like she was watching herself from the outside, disconnected. She'd pause for a moment, wondering if the person in the mirror was even real. The more she looked, the worse it became. Sophie started to feel like she wasn't the one making the decisions. Her body seemed to act independently of her will. She'd raise her hand to brush her hair, but it felt like someone else was controlling the movement. She'd try to speak, but her mouth moved, and words came out, but they weren't quite hers. It was like she was just an observer, trapped inside her own body. Her heart began to race. Am I going crazy? Sophie whispered to herself one night. She was staring at her reflection, almost pleading with it to make sense. But the face staring back at her only seemed to grow colder, more distant. She had to do something. So, she finally made an appointment with a therapist. Maybe it was just stress, right? Something manageable. But deep down, Sophie knew it wasn't. The therapist, Dr. Simmons, was kind and patient. He listened attentively as Sophie told him about her struggles, her increasing inability to connect with her own body. She described the strange detachment she felt, the sensation of floating above herself. Dr. Simmons nodded sympathetically and suggested a technique called somatic therapy. It was supposed to help her reconnect with her body, regain control over it. But the sessions didn't go as Sophie had expected. At first, she felt a faint sense of relief. Dr. Simmons guided her through exercises, asking her to focus on different parts of her body, encouraging her to feel each movement. But with every session, something darker started to unravel. The exercises seemed to peel away layers she didn't even know were there. With each word from Dr. Simmons, Sophie felt more and more like she was losing herself, like the thin thread that tied her to reality was slipping away. One evening, as she lay in bed, she felt the pressure of an invisible force. It was like something was slowly creeping inside her, growing stronger with every breath. Sophie tried to focus on her body, on her breath, but her limbs felt heavy, unnatural. She could hear her own voice in her head, but it sounded so foreign, so wrong. She was terrified. "What is happening to me?" she whispered to the darkness, feeling the room close in on her. Days passed, and Sophie's sense of reality continued to crumble. The detachment grew stronger. She no longer recognized herself when she looked in the mirror, not just her appearance, but the way her body moved. It felt like a different person was inside her, pulling the strings. She'd find herself doing things she didn't remember deciding to do, making tea in the middle of the night, going for long walks without knowing where she was headed. It wasn't her choice, but her body seemed to act as if it was. It was during one of these walks when Sophie realized something she hadn't before. She was no longer afraid. It was like she was floating above her own life, watching it unfold from a distance. She saw people pass by, but she couldn't connect with them. Her body was walking, moving, but it felt mechanical, like a puppet on strings. She wanted to scream, to ask for help, but no sound came out. By the time she returned home, it felt like her mind was a shattered mirror, with pieces of her life scattered all around. She collapsed on the floor, her head spinning. The therapist's words echoed in her ears. "We need to dive deeper, Sophie. It's all in your subconscious." But now, Sophie wasn't so sure that was a good idea. Sophie began to question everything. What if Dr. Simmons was right? What if her subconscious was hiding something so deep, so dark, that it was pulling her away from herself? The more she thought about it, the more the idea terrified her. What if her mind was hiding something so terrible that even she couldn't bear to know it? The pressure, the detachment, the feeling of being controlled, was it all a symptom of her own psyche? Or was there something worse, something supernatural, lurking within her? Her next session with Dr. Simmons pushed her further down this dark path. He asked her to close her eyes and picture herself walking through a door. "What do you see behind it?" he asked. Sophie hesitated, unsure if she wanted to know. But she complied, letting her imagination take her wherever it wanted to go. She stepped through the door in her mind, and instantly, everything changed. The room she entered was cold, dark. Shadows lurked in the corners, and she could feel a presence, something that wasn't her, but something familiar. Sophie turned to look at herself in the reflection, but it wasn't her face she saw. It was another face, twisted, distorted. It smiled at her, a cruel smile. And then, she heard a voice, not Dr. Simmons, but something else, whispering in her ear, "You shouldn't have come here." Sophie left the session shaken. She couldn't get the image of the twisted face out of her mind. It felt like it was following her, lurking just behind her eyes, always there, waiting to surface. That night, she lay in bed, trying to breathe through the overwhelming anxiety. Her body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the mattress. She closed her eyes, but the face was there again, staring back at her from the dark corners of her room. She sat up, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. Something wasn't right. Her limbs were moving of their own accord, her hands twitching, her legs shifting as if they were being controlled by someone else. She reached out and touched her arm, but it wasn't her touch. It was cold, unfamiliar. As if someone else's hand was inside hers, pulling her, guiding her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped inside her own body, and there was nothing she could do. Suddenly, the voice returned. It wasn't in her head anymore. It was real, coming from behind her, whispering, "You're mine now. You always have been." Days turned into weeks, and Sophie felt like she was losing her mind. The detachment grew more intense. She couldn't trust her own body anymore. Every step she took, every movement, felt foreign. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity eroding, like sand through her fingers. The face in the mirror no longer looked like her. It was an unfamiliar stranger, staring back with cold eyes. Dr. Simmons suggested they try a more intense form of therapy. Hypnosis. Sophie was desperate, so she agreed. He promised it would help her reconnect with her true self, uncover the deep layers of her subconscious that were holding her back. But as the session began, Sophie felt herself descending into a darker, deeper place than she ever imagined. Under hypnosis, Sophie found herself walking down a long, dark hallway. The shadows stretched out before her, each step echoing in the silence. She reached a door and opened it, stepping into a room she didn't recognize. The walls were covered in images, frightening, chaotic images, of herself. But these weren't just memories. They were memories of something else. Her body was moving on its own again, but this time, it wasn't her controlling it. It was something else, something darker, pulling her deeper. Sophie's mind began to unravel in that room. The images on the walls seemed to come to life, swirling around her, screaming at her. The whispers grew louder, no longer just in her ears, but all around her. The room felt like it was closing in, suffocating her. And then, she saw it, her. The twisted figure from her dreams, the one that had haunted her every step. It stood in the corner of the room, watching her with a knowing smile. "It's you," the figure said, its voice a low, haunting growl. "You've always known it was me. I've been inside you from the beginning." Sophie froze, unable to speak, unable to move. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing, and it reached out a hand to touch her face. As soon as its fingers made contact, Sophie screamed. The scream echoed, not just in her mind, but in the room, in the world. And then, everything went black. Sophie awoke in the therapist's office, her body rigid, her mind reeling. Dr. Simmons was sitting across from her, his face calm, but something about him seemed different. There was a knowing look in his eyes. "You've uncovered something, Sophie," he said softly. "Something you weren't ready to face." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand what was happening. Was this all just a dream? Or had she truly uncovered the darkness within her own mind? The figure, the whispers, the detachment, it all felt so real, so suffocating. But what if it wasn't just in her head? What if something else was controlling her? As she stood up to leave, Sophie caught one last glimpse of Dr. Simmons, his eyes following her every movement. She turned, but just before she reached the door, she saw something that made her heart stop. The figure from her dreams was standing in the corner of the room, smiling. And this time, it wasn't a dream. Sophie didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The figure from the room, from her mind, was following her now, like a shadow, lurking just behind her thoughts. She could feel it every time she looked in the mirror, every time her body moved without her permission. Sophie tried to shake it off, but she knew it was real. Whatever had been lurking in the depths of her mind had broken free, and now it was controlling her. She thought back to Dr. Simmons, to the hypnosis. Had he known? Had he been trying to pull something out of her, something that should have stayed buried? Sophie wasn't sure anymore. All she knew was that the face in the mirror wasn't hers. The body wasn't hers. And the figure, it wasn't hers either. It was all connected, all part of something much darker, much deeper. As Sophie stumbled through her days, her body moving like a puppet, she realized there was only one way out. But she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to take that step. She had to face the darkness. She had to face it. But what would happen to her once she did? Sophie made her decision. She would face it head-on. Whatever was controlling her, whatever was in her mind, she would confront it. She returned to Dr. Simmons, her resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't surprised when she walked through the door. He knew what she was about to do. Together, they went deeper into her subconscious, deeper than ever before. Sophie felt herself descending once again into the dark, cold room. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She saw the figure waiting for her, smiling. "You're mine," it whispered. But Sophie wasn't ready to give in. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she fought back. And as she did, she realized the truth. The figure wasn't some external force, it was her. It all started after the crash. The ship had gone down in the middle of the night, out of nowhere, just a loud crack, a gut-wrenching twist of metal, and then the black ocean swallowing us whole. We made it to the island, some of us barely alive. It wasn't much, just a small stretch of land with sharp rocks, dense trees, and no sign of life beyond us. But we were alive. That's all that mattered, right? But there was something wrong from the start. As soon as we washed up on the shore, the air felt thick, heavy, like something was watching us. We thought it was the shock of the crash, the salt water in our lungs, or the fear of being stranded. But the feeling didn't go away. It only got worse. That first night, we huddled together by the remains of the wreck. The fire was supposed to keep us safe, but the shadows kept moving, almost like they had a life of their own. We heard footsteps in the darkness, whispers in the wind. But when we looked, there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying gently, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But we knew something was there. The next day, we set out to find food and fresh water. The island seemed deserted. No animals, no signs of human life, just a whole lot of trees and brush. But the further we went, the more uneasy we felt. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the forest felt alive, as if the trees themselves were listening to us, waiting. By the second night, things took a darker turn. One of the guys, Chris, went missing. We didn't even realize he was gone at first. It wasn't until morning that we noticed his stuff was gone. No trace of him. No sign of struggle, just an empty spot where he had slept. We called his name, searched the island, but found nothing. Like he'd just disappeared into thin air. The weirdest part? We didn't hear him scream. No cries for help. No sound at all. It was like he just faded away. The others started to panic, but I kept telling them we'd find him. But deep down, I knew. This island wasn't as empty as it seemed. By the third day, we were running low on supplies. But it wasn't just hunger that gnawed at us, it was the feeling that something was out there, always just beyond our sight. We tried to stay together, always in pairs, but it didn't help. The island felt like a trap, slowly closing in on us. At night, the attacks started. It wasn't obvious at first. A few strange noises, things moving in the shadows, whispers that didn't make sense. Then, it was Mark. He was standing guard by the fire when something pulled him into the darkness. We heard his scream, but by the time we reached him, there was nothing. Just a blood-streaked trail leading into the woods, disappearing without a trace. Panic set in. We barricaded ourselves in the remains of the shipwreck, but it didn't feel safe anymore. It never did. I started seeing things, shapes in the corners of my eyes, flickers of movement that shouldn't have been there. But when I looked, nothing was there. The others were starting to see it too. Whatever was on this island was hunting us, and it was getting bolder. We decided to leave the wreck and try to get off the island. We had a plan, or at least we thought we did. We figured we could build a raft, use the current, and hope for the best. But something had already changed. The island wasn't letting us go. We didn't even make it halfway when the attacks started again. This time, it was Julia. She was the last one of us to go. 1 second, she was beside me, and the next, she was gone. Just like that. It was as if the island swallowed her whole, and no one could explain how or why. We searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The air felt thick with something we couldn't see, something we didn't want to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching us, studying us, waiting. The worst part was, we couldn't even agree on what we were dealing with. Was it the island itself? Some kind of curse? Or was it something worse, something that lived here long before us? I couldn't tell anymore, and neither could the others. But we knew one thing, we were being hunted. The days blurred together after that. It was just me and Joe left. Everyone else was gone. At first, we tried to hold on to hope, tried to stay calm. But with each passing night, it got harder. The attacks didn't stop. Every time we thought we were safe, it came for us, pulling us, pushing us, whispering things that made no sense. Joe had become quieter, more distant. He stopped looking at me, like he was seeing something I couldn't. At night, I could hear him talking to himself, but when I asked him who he was talking to, he wouldn't answer. He just looked at me like I was the crazy one. I didn't trust him anymore. I didn't trust anyone. But I still didn't want to be alone. We couldn't get off the island, and even worse, we couldn't leave each other behind. Whatever was out there was playing with us. It knew we were weak, knew we were desperate. It was the middle of the night when it happened. Joe disappeared. I don't know how or when, but 1 minute he was there, and the next, he was gone. I heard him screaming, but by the time I reached him, there was nothing left but a few broken branches, crushed under something heavy. I don't know if it was the fear, the isolation, or the madness of it all, but I couldn't bring myself to search for him. Not anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just hunting us. It was feeding on us, draining us one by one. I'm the last one left. I've stopped trying to figure out what's happening. I don't think it matters anymore. I don't even care if I make it off this island. There's something waiting for me now, something I can't outrun, no matter how fast I run. I feel it moving behind me, just out of reach. But it's getting closer. I know it is. It's only a matter of time. The sun is starting to set, and I know what's coming. The sounds have already started, those whispers, those footsteps that follow me everywhere. I don't know if they're real or if I'm just losing my mind. It doesn't matter. I've stopped caring. The island has changed me. I'm not the person who washed up here days ago. I don't even know who I am anymore. Every step feels like I'm walking on borrowed time. I've stopped looking over my shoulder. I don't need to anymore. Whatever is behind me will catch up soon enough. I keep hearing their voices, Chris, Mark, Julia, Joe. They're all here, somewhere. I'm starting to understand now. It's not just the island. It's what's inside us, what it feeds on. Our fear. Our desperation. And the worst part? I know that I'm already gone. Part 8. The shadows are getting longer, and the air is colder. I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me. I can feel it deep in my bones now, the weight of something dark and hungry moving around me, circling. At night, when I close my eyes, I see flashes of the others, their faces twisted in terror. Their eyes begging me to understand. But I can't. They're gone, just like everything else. I think I've started to see the truth. Whatever's here doesn't just kill you. It takes pieces of you, something deeper than your body. It takes your will, your spirit. That's why I can't shake the feeling that I've already been marked. It's already claimed me. I don't know what it wants from me anymore. It doesn't need my body. It wants something else. There's a part of me that just wants to give up, lie down, and let it take me. Let it end. But there's another part, something small, that keeps fighting. It's that part that keeps telling me not to stop, not to let it win. But how can I fight something I can't see, something that moves like the wind, unseen but ever present? I found something today. A cave, hidden behind thick vines. It was a long shot, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I could find some answers. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, like it had been waiting for me. I felt like I was being watched, every step echoing louder than the last. Inside, there were strange markings on the walls. Symbols, almost like writing, but not in any language I recognized. They glowed faintly in the dark, and when I touched one, the ground beneath me trembled. Something responded, like a low growl, vibrating through the rock. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. But I know one thing for sure now, whatever is on this island is old. Older than us. It has a purpose. And it's not going to stop until it finishes what it started. I feel it pulling me, and I don't think I can outrun it anymore. The island is quieter now, or maybe it's just me. I've lost track of the days, the time. There's no need to keep track anymore. The others are gone. Joe, Mark, Julia, they're all nothing but memories now. Shadows in my mind. And I'm starting to forget what it felt like to be normal, to be human. I think I'm starting to see things differently. The island isn't just hunting us. It's changing us, remaking us into something else. I can feel it, deep inside, the pull to join them. To become part of this place. The whispers have stopped. The footsteps have faded. But the island is still here, watching, waiting. And soon, I will be one with it, just another lost soul, another part of the darkness that this place thrives on. I'm already gone. We set out on our hike in the mountains with high hopes. The weather was perfect, the sun bright and warm, and we were all excited to explore the dense forest that stretched ahead of us. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. The trees seemed to grow denser, the paths narrower. We could hear the distant sound of a creek, but the deeper we went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in on us. By nightfall, the air grew cold. We set up camp by a small clearing, but something wasn't right. The sounds of the forest felt different, too loud, too close. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of insects had been replaced with something heavier. A low growl, maybe a distant howl, echoed through the trees. It sounded like something was moving just beyond our vision, following us, watching us. None of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. But, of course, we brushed it off as nothing. Just the fear that comes with being deep in the wilderness. It was only later, when we tried to sleep, that the first of us vanished. When we woke up in the morning, Sarah was gone. There was no sign of her, no tracks, no trail, nothing. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. At first, we thought maybe she'd gone off on her own for some reason, but that didn't make sense. We'd all camped close together, and no one had heard her leave. We called out for her, but the only response was the unsettling silence of the forest. Panic started to settle in, and we knew we needed to get out of there. But the more we tried to navigate our way out, the more disoriented we became. The trees all looked the same. The paths were twisted, looping back on themselves. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself overnight, trapping us. We tried using our phones, but there was no signal. We didn't even have a clear direction anymore. As night approached, the sounds in the forest grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the usual nighttime wildlife noises anymore. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, moving in sync with our own. We weren't alone. Something, or someone, was following us. By the next morning, things had gotten worse. Mark was the next to go. We had all been huddled together near the campfire when he stood up, saying he'd heard something in the distance. He wandered off to investigate, and we didn't see him again. We followed his tracks for a while, but they stopped suddenly, as if he'd just vanished into the forest. We started to panic. How was this possible? The forest felt alive in a way that didn't make sense. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching us, listening to our every move. We kept moving, but it felt like we were stuck in the same place. Every turn we took led to the same clearing. Every path we followed only took us deeper into the labyrinth. By now, the fear was overwhelming. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps following us anymore. It was something else. Something more sinister. There were whispers in the wind, soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to call out to us, urging us to go deeper, to follow them. But we couldn't trust it. It was as though the forest itself was trying to lead us further into its heart. That night, we tried to build a fire, but it was like the forest was suffocating it. The flames flickered and died almost immediately, leaving us in total darkness. We couldn't even hear the usual noises of the forest anymore. Everything was silent, except for the whispering wind. It was then that we realized we couldn't see the stars. The sky above us was completely black, as if the trees were blocking everything out. Out of nowhere, a low growl sounded from the darkness, closer than it had ever been. It wasn't an animal, it was something more monstrous. We didn't dare move. We didn't dare speak. The growl grew louder, and suddenly, we heard heavy breathing just behind us. It felt like something was right there, breathing down our necks, but when we turned around, there was nothing. No one. And then, like clockwork, Jesse was gone. One moment he was sitting next to me, the next he was simply gone. No trace, no sound. We searched for hours, shouting his name, but nothing. His disappearance was just like Sarah's, silent, quick, and complete. The forest is getting darker. I mean, the air feels heavier, the shadows deeper. We're losing our grip on time now. I don't know if it's been days or just hours since Jesse vanished. It doesn't matter. We're trapped in this endless loop. The forest is constantly shifting. I swear I see the same trees over and over again. No matter which direction we go, we always end up back in the same place. I can hear footsteps again, but this time, I know they're not just in my head. They're real. Whoever, or whatever, has been following us is still here, and it's getting closer. I don't even want to think about it anymore. I just want to escape. But escape feels impossible. This place doesn't let you leave. It traps you in its maze, and the more you try to break free, the more it tightens its grip. We've lost 2 more people since Jesse. Amy and Sam. Neither of them made a sound when they disappeared. One minute they were there, and the next, they were just gone. All we have left now is me, Greg, and Rachel. We've stopped trying to find our way out. There's no point anymore. The forest is alive, and it doesn't want us to leave. We tried to make camp again, hoping to rest, but the moment we settled down, the whispers came. They were louder now, surrounding us, echoing in every direction. Rachel started crying, clutching her head as though the voices were driving her mad. Greg was shaking, his eyes wild with fear. I was just trying to keep it together, trying to hold on to some sense of reality. That's when I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, something was moving. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it got closer, I could make out its shape. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs that bent at strange angles. Its face was featureless, just a pale blur. But its eyes, God, those eyes. They were glowing, bright and hungry. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. Greg saw it too. He looked at me, his face pale with terror. "We have to run," he whispered. But before we could do anything, the figure was gone. Vanished into the trees like it had never been there. We didn't need to say anything. We knew. It was hunting us. The hours that followed were a blur. We kept walking, trying to make it out of the forest, but it felt like the path was deliberately shifting, pulling us deeper into the maze. The trees seemed to close in, blocking our way. Every time we turned around, the forest was different. Nothing was familiar anymore. Rachel was the next to go. I don't even know when it happened. One moment she was beside me, whispering in panic about the voices, and the next, nothing. Just an empty space where she had been. I don't know if she ran, or if she was taken. Either way, she's gone now, just like the others. Greg and I are the only ones left. We've stopped talking. What's the point? The silence is suffocating. We don't know where we are anymore. There's no way out. I can feel it closing in on me. Whatever's in this forest is not letting us leave. And I'm starting to think it never will. The thing is, I'm starting to believe it's not just hunting us. It's feeding off us, piece by piece. Our fear, our panic, it's like it's drawing power from it. And the more it takes, the less I feel like myself. The less human I feel. I've stopped looking at Greg. I can't. Because every time I do, it feels like he's slipping away from me. Like he's already gone. I can't explain it, but I think I'm losing time. I'll blink, and suddenly we've moved hours ahead. Or maybe it's just the forest warping everything, making it harder to distinguish between reality and whatever this place has become. I'm sure I heard something in the trees tonight. Something large. I don't know how much longer I can last. The longer we stay, the more I feel like I'm fading away, like I'm becoming part of the forest itself. It feels wrong, so wrong, but I can't stop. I hear it now, every night. The footsteps. The whispering. The growl. The thing in the trees. It's getting closer, always closer. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. But it's here, and it's been here for a long time. And I think it's ready to take me now. You know how storms can be both terrifying and fascinating? That's what made Lucas, a lone traveler, decide to venture deep into the wilderness. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to be alone, away from the noise of the city. But he didn't expect the storm. The sky turned gray so quickly it felt like a warning. The first night, the wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking his tent to its core. Lucas tried to sleep, telling himself it was just the weather. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, guttural groan, too deep to be the wind and too strange to be an animal. He sat up, gripping his flashlight like a weapon, heart pounding. The groan faded, but the storm raged on. By morning, he was rattled but alive. The rain hadn't let up, and the landscape had transformed into a soggy, unfamiliar maze. Every path he thought he remembered was now an endless stretch of mud and shadow. And worse, the groan from the night before haunted him. What was it? The second night was worse. The wind seemed to scream his name, twisting and bending the trees until they looked like clawing hands. Lucas tried to ignore it, focusing on the small fire he'd managed to light. But then he saw something, just a flicker, a movement in the corner of his eye. He turned, but nothing was there. Or was it? The groan came again, louder this time. It was closer, and Lucas felt his stomach drop. He crawled into his tent, clutching the knife he always carried for safety. His breathing was shallow, every muscle tense. The groan turned into a laugh, soft, mocking, and inhuman. Morning brought no relief. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and Lucas realized he was completely alone. No rescue would come. His supplies were running low, and the fear from the night had drained his energy. But the worst part? He could see footprints, large, misshapen ones, leading away from his camp. Lucas followed the footprints. He told himself it was a bad idea, but he had to know. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the storm was messing with him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The tracks led into the forest, where the trees grew so close together they almost blotted out the sky. Every step felt like a mistake. The deeper he went, the darker it got, and the sound of the storm faded. In its place was silence. And then, a whisper. It was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves, but it carried words he couldn't quite understand. His heart raced as he realized it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stumbled back to his camp as fast as he could, tripping over roots and slipping in the mud. When he finally got there, his fire was out. His tent was torn open. And the footprints? They were back, circling his camp like a predator sizing up its prey. The third night was a nightmare. Lucas didn't bother with the tent. He climbed a tree, thinking he'd be safer off the ground. The storm roared around him, but it felt distant, like a sound from another world. He clung to the branches, soaked and shivering, as the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. He could almost make out the words, something about being lost, being claimed. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but then the tree began to shake. Not from the wind, but from something heavy moving below. He looked down and froze. In the shadows, he saw it, a hulking, misshapen figure, its form shifting and blending into the darkness. It stood at the base of the tree, looking up at him with eyes that glowed faintly, like embers. Lucas didn't breathe. He didn't move. The thing stayed there for what felt like hours before disappearing into the storm. The next day, Lucas decided to leave. He didn't care where he went as long as it was away from that place. But every path he took seemed to lead him back to the same spot. His footprints, his gear, it was all there, no matter how far he walked. The storm seemed to follow him, mocking his attempts to escape. By midday, he gave up. Exhausted, he collapsed against the tree, his mind racing. What was happening to him? Was it the storm? The forest? Or was he losing his mind? He closed his eyes, trying to think, but when he opened them, he wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away. This time, it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Lucas scrambled to his feet, heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It just melted back into the storm. Lucas knew he couldn't survive much longer. His food was almost gone, his water soaked by the unending rain. Every time he tried to think, his mind spiraled back to the figure. What was it? Why was it following him? That night, he built a fire again, but it felt useless. The shadows crept closer no matter how bright the flames burned. The whispers returned, louder than ever, almost chanting now. Lucas couldn't understand the words, but they filled him with dread. He grabbed his knife and stood by the fire, daring the darkness to show itself. "Come on," he yelled, his voice breaking. "If you're real, come and face me." And it did. The figure emerged from the trees, slow and deliberate. Its shape was wrong, shifting between human and beast, its glowing eyes locked on him. Lucas raised his knife, but his hands trembled so badly he almost dropped it. The figure stepped closer, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Lucas woke up sprawled on the wet ground, his fire reduced to smoldering ashes. He didn't remember passing out, but the figure was gone. His knife lay next to him, bent and useless. The storm raged on, but it felt quieter now, as if it was watching him, waiting for something. He checked his belongings, what little he had left. His compass was shattered, and his map was smeared with mud. As he packed, he noticed something carved into the tree near his camp. It was a symbol, jagged and unnatural, glowing faintly like the figure's eyes. He touched it, and a searing pain shot through his hand. The whispers came again, this time inside his head. They weren't words anymore, but emotions, rage, sorrow, hunger. Lucas staggered back, clutching his head. The storm grew louder, and the trees seemed to close in around him. He realized he wasn't just lost. He was trapped. Desperation set in. Lucas ran blindly through the forest, not caring where he went as long as it was away. But the storm followed, and so did the figure. Every time he thought he'd escaped, it appeared again, closer than before. He stopped calling for help. No one could hear him out here. On the 8th night, he found a cave. It wasn't much, but it felt like shelter. He crawled inside, shivering and wet, and lit a small fire. For the first time, the storm seemed to fade, the howling wind replaced by an eerie silence. Lucas almost let himself believe he was safe. But then he saw the footprints. They weren't his. They led deeper into the cave, disappearing into the shadows. He should have left, but something drew him in. He followed the prints, his heart pounding, until he reached the end of the cave. There, etched into the wall, was the same glowing symbol. And beneath it, a single word, submit. Lucas couldn't stop staring at the word. It seemed alive, pulsating with the same malevolent energy as the figure. The whispers returned, filling the cave with their relentless chant. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred. He backed away, but the shadows seemed to close in, pushing him toward the wall. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice echoing through the cave. But the whispers only grew louder. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the storm outside surged with renewed fury. the figure appeared at the cave entrance, its shape more defined now, more human, but not quite. It spoke for the first time, its voice a low rumble that echoed in Lucas's chest. "You are ours." Lucas tried to fight, to crawl away, but the shadows enveloped him, dragging him toward the glowing symbol. He clawed at the ground, but it was no use. Lucas awoke to silence. The storm was gone, the forest eerily calm. He was lying on the forest floor, his body heavy and cold. He sat up slowly, his mind foggy. The whispers were gone, but something felt wrong. He looked down at his hands, they weren't his. The skin was rough, mottled, almost inhuman. He stumbled to a nearby stream, desperate to see his reflection. What stared back at him wasn't Lucas. It was something else, something twisted and monstrous. He screamed, but it came out as a guttural roar. The realization hit him like a blow. He hadn't escaped. He had become the figure. Now, the storm followed him wherever he went. He wandered the forest endlessly, drawn to lost travelers like he once was. The cycle continued, the whispers guiding him to new prey. Lucas was no longer the victim. He was the storm's servant. The mountain looked innocent enough at first. The team of 5, Mark, Sarah, Ben, Alex, and Chloe, had climbed tougher peaks before. They were prepared, gear polished, rations packed, spirits high. But as the sun dipped behind jagged ridges and the wind picked up, something shifted. Sarah noticed it first. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, turning sharply. A faint crunch, like boots on snow, echoed in the silence. "No one's out here but us," Mark replied, scanning the trail behind them. The rest of the group shrugged it off, blaming the altitude or their nerves. Still, an unspoken unease settled over them. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the cold felt sharper, almost biting. By the time they set up camp, everyone avoided mentioning the feeling they all shared, that they weren't alone. That night, the first incident happened. Chloe woke suddenly, hearing what sounded like breathing just outside her tent. She held her breath, heart pounding, but when she peeked out, the campsite was still. No footprints, no movement. But the feeling stayed with her, clawing at the edges of her mind. The next day, the trail was brutal. Icy winds whipped their faces, and every step felt heavier. Ben, always the skeptic, joked to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot. Or some mountain spirit mad we're here." The others laughed weakly, but no one responded. Jokes didn't dispel the gnawing tension. As they climbed higher, Mark froze mid-step. "Wait," he whispered, holding up a hand. Far below, in the valley they'd crossed hours ago, a figure moved. It was small, distant, but undeniably there. "A hiker?" Sarah suggested, though her voice wavered. Mark shook his head. "No. They're too close. They shouldn't have made it up that fast." They pressed on, moving faster now, though none of them said why. The figure never followed, at least not where they could see. But each time someone glanced back, they swore the shadows seemed deeper, like the mountain itself was alive and watching. By the third day, nerves were frayed. Sarah snapped at Ben for lagging, and Alex barely spoke. They pitched their tents early, hoping rest would ease the tension. But rest wouldn't come. That night, the noises returned. This time, it wasn't just one person who heard it. Footsteps circled the campsite, deliberate and heavy, crunching the snow like a predator stalking prey. Mark unzipped his tent and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The beam sliced through the darkness but revealed nothing. Yet the sounds didn't stop. They only grew closer. "What is it?" Chloe whispered, clutching her jacket. Mark shook his head. "I don't know." The group huddled together, backs to the fire, eyes scanning the night. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a faint voice called out, a mimic of Chloe's voice, whispering her name. Morning came, but it brought no comfort. Alex was missing. His tent was still zipped from the inside, his gear untouched, but he was gone. No footprints led away from the site. "This doesn't make sense," Mark muttered, pacing. Where could he have gone? Ben, usually the loudest, was pale and silent. Chloe sat shaking, clutching her knees. "We need to go back," she said finally. "Forget the summit. We need to get off this mountain." Mark hesitated. Turning back now meant admitting defeat, but the group's fear was palpable. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "We head down." The descent wasn't easier. The wind howled louder than ever, and the trail felt foreign, as though the mountain itself was shifting. Each time someone glanced back, they swore they saw movement, flickers of something darting between the rocks. The path down twisted cruelly, leading them into unfamiliar territory. By midday, it was clear they were lost. This isn't where we came up," Sarah stammered, staring at a sheer cliff they hadn't seen before. Mark cursed under his breath, consulting the map to no avail. As they debated their next move, a low rumble echoed through the peaks. At first, they thought it was an avalanche. Then they realized it was a laugh, deep, guttural, and unnatural. "That's not possible," Ben whispered, his eyes wide. Chloe clung to Sarah, tears streaming silently down her face. Night fell quickly, and the group was forced to set up camp again. No one wanted to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding rocks. And in those shadows, something moved. Chloe woke first, gasping for air. She felt a hand on her shoulder, shaking her awake. But when she turned, no one was there. She scrambled out of her tent, heart pounding. The campsite was empty. "Mark?" "Sarah," she called out, her voice trembling. The wind answered her, carrying with it faint whispers that sounded almost human. She spun around, flashlight flickering, and caught a glimpse of something, pale and hunched, disappearing into the trees. The others returned, drawn by her screams. "We're being hunted," Ben said flatly, no longer trying to mask his fear. "This, whatever it is, it's playing with us." Mark nodded grimly. "We keep moving. No more stopping, no matter how tired we get." Their decision to push forward came too late. By dawn, Sarah was gone. Her tent was shredded, and the snow beneath it was stained red. No one spoke as they packed up and moved on. There was nothing to say. The whispers grew louder, echoing in their ears even when the wind died down. Sometimes they sounded like Alex, or Sarah, calling for help. Other times, they were unintelligible, but always close. "Don't listen to them," Mark warned. "They're trying to lure us off the trail." But the trail itself seemed to disappear, replaced by endless snow and jagged rocks. The group trudged forward, each step heavier than the last. And all the while, the shadows danced just out of reach. By the 8th day, it was just Mark and Chloe. Ben had vanished during a brief rest, his pack left behind. They didn't bother calling for him. They knew it was useless. "We're not getting out of this," Chloe said quietly, her voice hollow. Mark didn't argue. The mountain seemed alive now, shifting and groaning beneath their feet. Shapes moved in the corners of their vision, too fast to identify but too real to dismiss. The whispers had turned into screams, echoing their own thoughts and fears back at them. Mark clutched Chloe's hand tightly as they stumbled forward. "Just keep going," he muttered. "We have to keep moving." But even he didn't believe it anymore. That night, the fire wouldn't stay lit. Chloe sat close to Mark, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't." Mark wrapped an arm around her, but his own fear was palpable. The thing stalking them finally showed itself. It stepped into the dim light, a grotesque, shifting mass of shadows and limbs, its face a horrifying amalgamation of their lost friends. It didn't attack. It just stood there, watching, its presence more terrifying than any assault. Mark grabbed Chloe's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Run," he said. They sprinted into the darkness, the creature's laughter echoing behind them. Chloe didn't make it. Mark didn't see her fall, but he heard her scream, a sound that would haunt him forever. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in the snow. The mountain was silent again, the creature gone, or so it seemed. When rescuers found Mark days later, he was delirious, frostbitten, and alone. He tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed him. They chalked it up to hypothermia and trauma. But Mark knew the truth. The mountain wasn't just dangerous, it was alive. And it had claimed his friends, leaving him to carry the weight of their fate. You know how everyone says the mountains are peaceful? They're lying. At least, that's what I learned when Sam, Claire, Mike, and I got lost in those damned peaks last winter. We thought we were prepared. Maps, gear, supplies, everything we needed for a weekend of hiking and fresh air. But the snowstorm hit out of nowhere, blinding us and swallowing the trail. By the time we found the cabin, we were half frozen and desperate. It looked like salvation, sturdy wood walls, a stone chimney puffing faint smoke, even a small porch. No one answered when we knocked, but the door creaked open like it was waiting for us. Inside, it was eerily clean, with a faint smell of pine and something else, something metallic. "Looks abandoned," Mike said, dropping his pack by the door. "We'll just stay tonight." None of us argued. The storm howled outside, making the place feel like a safe haven. But I swear, as we settled in, the air grew heavier, like the walls were holding their breath. The first strange thing happened after dinner. Claire found a journal tucked under a pile of firewood. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages were stiff with age. She opened it up, curious, and we all crowded around. The entries were short and frantic, written in jagged handwriting. "The whispers won't stop," one read. "I can't tell what's real anymore." Another said, "They're in the walls. Watching. Waiting." Sam laughed nervously. "Probably just some old crank who lost it up here." But Claire looked pale. "It's dated from 20 years ago," she said. That night, none of us slept well. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind scraping against the windows, felt deliberate. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps upstairs. But when I checked, the second floor was empty, just an empty hallway and doors that wouldn't open. The morning didn't bring relief. The storm had worsened, and the trail leading down was buried under several feet of snow. "We're stuck," Sam said grimly, staring out the frost-covered window. "Maybe for a few days." Mike tried to lighten the mood by chopping wood outside, but even he couldn't hide the tension. Claire kept reading the journal, flipping through the pages with growing unease. "Listen to this," she said. They came at night. I heard them whispering my name. Then they took her. I saw her face at the window, but it wasn't her anymore. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. By afternoon, the cabin started to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. I noticed strange things, a mirror that showed faint shapes moving behind us, the fire flickering even though the air was still. And always, that metallic smell, stronger now, like blood. That evening, the cabin revealed its first real secret. Mike found the trapdoor while sweeping snow off the porch. Looks like a cellar, he said, prying it open. A cold, damp draft wafted up, carrying that same metallic scent but stronger. We argued about going down, but curiosity won. Armed with flashlights, we descended into the darkness. The cellar was lined with shelves of rusted tools and jars filled with murky liquid. In the corner, Claire found a bundle of old photos, black and white shots of hikers and families, all smiling. But the last photo in each stack was different. The people were staring blankly, their faces blurred like they'd been smeared with wet paint. What the hell is this? Sam muttered, holding up one of the photos. No one answered. That's when we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the far wall. We froze, flashlights flickering, as the sound grew louder. We bolted back upstairs, slamming the trapdoor shut and piling furniture on top of it. There's something down there, Claire said, her voice cracking. Something alive. Mike shook his head. No way. It's probably just rats. But none of us believed him. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. The shadows seemed darker, and every corner felt like it was hiding something. As night fell, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind slipping through the cracks. But soon, they grew louder, distinct. I swear I heard my name, drawn out slowly, like a taunt. Claire screamed when the window shattered in the kitchen. We rushed in to find nothing but shards of glass and snow blowing in. But outside, in the fresh snow, were footprints. Bare footprints. And they led straight to the cabin. We barricaded the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The whispers turned into pounding, heavy thuds against the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere at once, like the cabin itself was alive. Stay together, Sam ordered, though his hands were shaking. We huddled in the main room, the fire barely keeping the cold at bay. The pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by a new sound, laughter. It was faint, like it was coming from inside the walls. Claire broke down, sobbing. The journal, she cried. It says they'll take us one by one. It says we can't leave. Sam grabbed the book, flipping through it frantically. The last entry was smeared with something dark but legible. The cabin doesn't let you go. It becomes you. The next morning, Mike was gone. His boots and coat were still by the door, and his pack was untouched. He wouldn't go outside without them, Claire whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Sam clenched his fists. We're getting out of here. Today. But the storm hadn't let up. The snow was waist deep, and the trail was invisible. As we stumbled through the drifts, I swear the cabin seemed to follow us. Every time we looked back, it was there, looming in the distance, closer than it should have been. Claire screamed when she tripped and fell into a hollow in the snow. Beneath her was another cabin, identical to the first. Its door creaked open, revealing darkness inside. No, Sam muttered. This can't be real. We ran back to the original cabin, defeated. The storm had trapped us, and now it felt like the cabin itself was playing with us. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. They sounded like Mike this time, begging us to come outside. "I can't take this anymore," Claire sobbed, covering her ears. Sam tried to comfort her, but even he looked ready to snap. I stared at the trapdoor, dreading what lay beneath. Whatever was happening to us had started down there. Around midnight, Claire stood up suddenly. "I'm going outside," she said, her voice eerily calm. We tried to stop her, but she slipped out the door and vanished into the storm. Her scream echoed moments later, then silence. It was just me and Sam now. We didn't talk, didn't sleep. We just sat by the fire, waiting for whatever was coming next. The cabin groaned around us, the walls shifting like they were breathing. At some point, Sam stood up, gripping the journal tightly. "It's the cabin," he said. "It needs us to stay. To feed it." His eyes were wild, and I realized he'd lost it. Before I could stop him, he ran to the trapdoor and threw it open. "I'm ending this," he shouted, disappearing into the darkness below. I heard him screaming, then nothing. The whispers stopped. The pounding stopped. The cabin was silent, and I was alone. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the fire until it burned out. Eventually, the storm died, and I found the strength to leave. The trail reappeared like it had never been gone, and I stumbled back to civilization. No one believed me when I told them what happened. Search parties found no trace of the cabin, no footprints, no bodies. Just endless snow and silence. But I know what I saw. That cabin is still out there, waiting for its next visitors. And whatever secret it holds, it doesn't want to be discovered. So, you know those stories about the Arctic being this beautiful, untouched wilderness? Forget all that. It's nothing like the travel brochures, especially when you're stranded there with nothing but endless ice and the feeling you're being watched. That's exactly what happened to us. Our team, me, Dr. Ellis, Jake, Sarah, and our guide, Nikolai, headed out on an expedition to map a part of the polar region no one had explored before. At first, it was incredible. Endless white plains stretching to the horizon, the kind of silence you could feel in your bones. But even then, something felt off. Nikolai, who had spent his life in these regions, kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to appear. When we asked him about it, he shrugged it off, saying, "This land, it doesn't like strangers." By the third day, the weather turned brutal. Temperatures plummeted, and the wind was so strong it felt like needles stabbing our faces. That's when we found it, the first frozen animal. A polar bear, massive and powerful, just lying there like it had fallen asleep and never woken up. Its eyes were open, and its face was twisted in terror. Dr. Ellis said it was probably starvation or the cold, but Nikolai disagreed. He muttered something in Russian, and when I pressed him, he finally said, "Animals here, they don't die like this." Not without reason. That comment stuck with me, but we kept moving. That night, as we set up camp, we heard the first noise. It sounded like something scratching against the walls of our tent. Jake grabbed a flashlight and checked outside, but there was nothing there, just the wind and snow. Still, the sound didn't stop. It moved, circling us, faint but constant. By morning, we were exhausted. None of us had slept well, and Sarah looked like she was on the edge of tears. But what really freaked us out was what we found outside: tracks. They were huge, too big to be human but with an almost human-like shape. They started near our tents and led off into the distance, disappearing into the ice. We followed the tracks for a while, hoping to make sense of them, but they just seemed to vanish. Nikolai told us we shouldn't have done that. You don't follow what you don't understand, he warned. Still, we had a job to do, and we pressed on. The second frozen animal was a seal, curled up near a hole in the ice. Like the bear, its face was twisted in fear, its body perfectly preserved. What's killing them? Jake asked, but no one had an answer. The air felt heavier, colder, like the land itself was warning us to leave. That night, we lost Sarah. One moment she was sitting in the tent, staring at the fire, and the next, she was gone. Her boots and coat were still there, but the tent flap was open, flapping in the wind. We searched for hours, yelling her name until our throats hurt. All we found was a single set of footprints, leading into the darkness. After Sarah disappeared, things started unraveling fast. Jake was furious, accusing Nikolai of not warning us properly about the dangers. Nikolai just sat there, quiet, staring into the fire like it held all the answers. Meanwhile, Dr. Ellis tried to keep everyone calm, but even she looked scared. The whispers started the next night. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on us, but it wasn't. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it was there. Words we couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that didn't sound human. Dr. Ellis tried to rationalize it. "It's the wind through the ice," she said, but even she didn't believe it. The whispers grew louder as the night wore on, and when we woke up, we found something new, more tracks. This time, they circled our camp completely, like whatever made them had been watching us all night. Jake was the next to go. It happened so fast we didn't even realize he was missing until morning. His sleeping bag was empty, and there was no sign of a struggle. Just more of those damn tracks, leading away from camp. Nikolai said we needed to leave, to go back the way we came, but the storm had other plans. Whiteout conditions made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and our GPS wasn't working. It was like the land was keeping us there, trapping us. Dr. Ellis started showing signs of frostbite, and Nikolai wasn't looking much better. The cold was relentless, seeping into our bones no matter how many layers we wore. And then there were the nights, long, dark, and filled with those whispers. I started to wonder if we'd ever see the sun again. We stumbled across an old outpost on the 6th day, a small wooden shack, half buried in snow. It looked abandoned, but we didn't care. Any shelter was better than freezing out in the open. Inside, it was even colder than outside, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in decades. There were signs that someone had lived there long ago, a rusted stove, a few broken tools, and a journal left on the table. Nikolai refused to touch it, but Dr. Ellis opened it up, flipping through the brittle pages. "They came in the night," she read aloud. "I hear them outside, calling my name. I don't think I'll make it." We didn't stay long in the shack. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. As we stepped back out into the snow, I thought I saw movement in the distance, something tall and pale, just at the edge of my vision. By now, we were down to 3, me, Dr. Ellis, and Nikolai. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and our supplies were running low. Nikolai kept muttering to himself in Russian, something about spirits of the ice and how we'd angered them by coming here. That night, we built our camp inside a shallow ice cave, hoping it would offer some protection from the cold. But the whispers found us anyway, louder and more insistent than before. I swear I heard Sarah's voice among them, calling for help. Dr. Ellis started losing it. She kept saying she could see faces in the ice, watching us, waiting. At one point, she screamed and tried to run out into the storm, but Nikolai tackled her and dragged her back inside. "They want us to leave," he said. But we can't. Not yet. The next morning, Nikolai was gone. His pack was still there, but his coat and boots were missing. Dr. Ellis broke down completely, sobbing and shaking as she clutched the journal we'd taken from the shack. "We're going to die here," she whispered. "Just like them." I didn't have the heart to argue. The whispers were constant now, following us wherever we went. The tracks we'd been seeing were more frequent, crisscrossing the landscape in impossible patterns. That's when I saw it, whatever had been stalking us. It was tall and gaunt, its pale skin blending with the snow. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its movements were unnaturally smooth, like it wasn't bound by the same rules as us. It didn't come closer, but I knew it was waiting for the right moment. Dr. Ellis didn't last long after that. She wandered off during the night, leaving nothing behind but her scarf, which I found tangled in a bush the next morning. I was completely alone now, surrounded by nothing but ice and silence. I tried to retrace our steps, to find the trail we'd used to get here, but it was useless. The landscape had changed, or maybe I had. Every direction looked the same, white and empty, stretching on forever. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, echoing in my head no matter how hard I tried to block them out. I started to wonder if I'd even make it back, or if I'd end up like the others, just another name lost to the ice. I don't remember how I made it out. One minute I was stumbling through the snow, half dead from cold and hunger, and the next I was being pulled onto a rescue sled. They told me I'd been missing for 2 weeks, but it felt like years. No one believed me when I told them what happened. They said it was the cold, that it makes people see and hear things. But I know the truth. The Arctic isn't just empty, it's alive. And it doesn't want us there. I still dream about it sometimes. The whispers, the tracks, the thing I saw in the snow. And every time I wake up, I can feel it watching, waiting for me to return. It all started with the eclipse. At first, everyone thought it was just another astronomical event, a cool thing to watch and maybe snap a few photos of. But when the sun didn't come back, that's when the panic started. The sky stayed black, and no amount of waiting changed it. Hours turned into days, and we realized something was horribly wrong. People tried to explain it, scientists, news anchors, even religious leaders. But no one had answers. Power grids failed because the solar plants stopped working, and soon, cities were plunged into total darkness. Flashlights and candles became more valuable than gold. Then came the creatures. At first, we didn't know they were there. People just started disappearing, 1 or 2 at a time. But soon enough, we saw them. They didn't look real, more like shadows that could move and twist unnaturally. And they were fast. Too fast. I was with a group of survivors, about 10 of us. We holed up in an old grocery store, thinking we could barricade ourselves in and wait it out. It felt safe at first. We had food, water, and enough light to keep the dark at bay. But it didn't last long. One night, we heard something scratching at the windows. It was faint at first, almost like tree branches, but there were no trees nearby. Then we saw them, those creatures. They didn't have eyes, or if they did, they were hidden in the blackness of their forms. But they knew we were there. It was Mia who panicked first. She screamed, ran toward the back door, and tried to get out. We yelled for her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. As soon as she opened the door, they got her. I'll never forget the sound she made, this guttural, choked scream that was cut off way too fast. After Mia, we knew we had to move. The grocery store was no longer safe, and staying in one place for too long seemed to attract them. So, we packed what we could and left under the cover of darkness. Ironic, isn't it? Darkness was everywhere. We stuck to small roads, moving as quietly as possible. The only light we had came from old battery-powered lanterns and a few lighters. The world felt alien, like it wasn't ours anymore. Even the air smelled different, thick, stale, like it was rotting around us. That's when we found the first clue about what was going on. In an abandoned library, one of the guys, David, found a book. It wasn't special at first glance, just an old, dusty thing. But inside were notes, handwritten scribbles about some ancient ritual. Whoever wrote it claimed the darkness wasn't natural, that it was summoned. David became obsessed with that book. He kept reading the notes over and over, muttering about how the darkness was alive and how it feeds on fear. At first, we thought he was losing it, but then weird things started happening. The lanterns began flickering more often, even though the batteries were new. We'd hear whispers when no one was speaking, just faint enough to make you question if you'd really heard them. And the creatures, they were getting bolder. One night, we saw one standing just outside our camp, not moving, just watching. We didn't sleep much after that. David swore the book held the answer, that it could tell us how to stop all this. But the rest of us weren't so sure. If the darkness was summoned, how could a bunch of ordinary people hope to fight something like that? Our group kept shrinking. Amanda disappeared during one of our nighttime treks. One moment she was behind me, holding onto the strap of my backpack, and the next, she was gone. We didn't even hear her scream. Just gone. It was harder to keep going after that. Every step felt heavier, every shadow seemed like it was hiding something. Even our conversations started to fade. It's hard to talk when you're too scared to make noise. That's when we found the church. It was this old, crumbling building on a hill, surrounded by overgrown weeds. It didn't look like much, but it had walls and a heavy door, so we decided to stay there for the night. That's where we found the second clue, an altar covered in symbols that matched the ones in David's book. The symbols on the altar were creepy, no doubt about it. They were carved deep into the stone, like someone had spent years making them. David said they were part of the ritual that summoned the darkness, but he didn't know how to reverse it. "There's a missing piece," he kept saying, flipping through the book like a madman. That night, we heard something new. It wasn't scratching or whispers this time, it was a voice. A deep, gravelly thing that echoed through the church, calling our names. We huddled together, too scared to move, while the voice circled the building. Then it stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. That's when the door started to shake, like something was trying to break it down. We held it shut, praying it wouldn't get in. Eventually, the banging stopped, but none of us slept after that. By now, it was just me, David, and a guy named Sam. We'd lost everyone else, some to the creatures, others to their own panic. The church felt like a tomb, and the air inside was getting colder by the hour. David finally found the missing piece. At the back of the book, hidden in a folded page, was a map. It showed a place far to the north, marked with the same symbols as the altar. "This is it," David said. "This is where it started." We didn't have a choice. Staying in the church was suicide, and going back the way we came was just as bad. So, we packed what little we had left and started heading toward the spot on the map. I don't think any of us really believed we'd make it, but we had to try. The journey north was brutal. The air felt colder with every step, and the darkness seemed thicker somehow, like it was alive and pressing in on us. Sam was the next to go. One moment he was walking ahead of us, holding the map, and the next, he was screaming. We found what was left of him a few minutes later. His body was there, but his face, it was like something had erased it, leaving only smooth skin. David threw up, and I wasn't far behind him. After that, it was just me and David. We didn't talk much, just kept moving, driven by some desperate hope that the map would lead us to answers, or at least an end to all this. When we finally reached the spot on the map, it wasn't what I expected. It was a cave, hidden behind a wall of jagged rocks. Inside, the air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the walls were covered in those same symbols we'd seen on the altar. At the center of the cave was a pedestal, and on it sat a strange object, a black orb that seemed to suck in all the light around it. "This is it," David whispered, his voice trembling. "This is what they used to summon the darkness." Before I could stop him, he reached out and touched it. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground shook, and a deafening roar filled the cave. David screamed, and the orb shattered into 1,000 pieces, releasing a wave of cold that knocked me off my feet. When I woke up, the cave was empty. David was gone, and the orb was nothing but shards scattered across the floor. Outside, the world was still dark, but something felt different. The creatures were gone, or at least I couldn't feel them anymore. I made my way back to what was left of civilization, but it wasn't much. The darkness had taken too much: people, cities, hope. Now, we live in the shadows, scavenging for what little we can find. Sometimes, I wonder if breaking the orb actually did anything. The sun hasn't come back, and the world is still cold and dead. But the whispers are gone, and for now, that's enough. I just hope David found peace, wherever he ended up. It all started with the eclipse. At first, everyone thought it was just another astronomical event, a cool thing to watch and maybe snap a few photos of. But when the sun didn't come back, that's when the panic started. The sky stayed black, and no amount of waiting changed it. Hours turned into days, and we realized something was horribly wrong. People tried to explain it, scientists, news anchors, even religious leaders. But no one had answers. Power grids failed because the solar plants stopped working, and soon, cities were plunged into total darkness. Flashlights and candles became more valuable than gold. Then came the creatures. At first, we didn't know they were there. People just started disappearing, one or two at a time. But soon enough, we saw them. They didn't look real, more like shadows that could move and twist unnaturally. And they were fast. Too fast. I was with a group of survivors, about 10 of us. We holed up in an old grocery store, thinking we could barricade ourselves in and wait it out. It felt safe at first. We had food, water, and enough light to keep the dark at bay. But it didn't last long. One night, we heard something scratching at the windows. It was faint at first, almost like tree branches, but there were no trees nearby. Then we saw them, those creatures. They didn't have eyes, or if they did, they were hidden in the blackness of their forms. But they knew we were there. It was Mia who panicked first. She screamed, ran toward the back door, and tried to get out. We yelled for her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. As soon as she opened the door, they got her. I'll never forget the sound she made, this guttural, choked scream that was cut off way too fast. After Mia, we knew we had to move. The grocery store was no longer safe, and staying in one place for too long seemed to attract them. So, we packed what we could and left under the cover of darkness. Ironic, isn't it? Darkness was everywhere. We stuck to small roads, moving as quietly as possible. The only light we had came from old battery-powered lanterns and a few lighters. The world felt alien, like it wasn't ours anymore. Even the air smelled different, thick, stale, like it was rotting around us. That's when we found the first clue about what was going on. In an abandoned library, one of the guys, David, found a book. It wasn't special at first glance, just an old, dusty thing. But inside were notes, handwritten scribbles about some ancient ritual. Whoever wrote it claimed the darkness wasn't natural, that it was summoned. David became obsessed with that book. He kept reading the notes over and over, muttering about how the darkness was alive and how it feeds on fear. At first, we thought he was losing it, but then weird things started happening. The lanterns began flickering more often, even though the batteries were new. We'd hear whispers when no one was speaking, just faint enough to make you question if you'd really heard them. And the creatures, they were getting bolder. One night, we saw one standing just outside our camp, not moving, just watching. We didn't sleep much after that. David swore the book held the answer, that it could tell us how to stop all this. But the rest of us weren't so sure. If the darkness was summoned, how could a bunch of ordinary people hope to fight something like that? Our group kept shrinking. Amanda disappeared during one of our nighttime treks. One moment she was behind me, holding onto the strap of my backpack, and the next, she was gone. We didn't even hear her scream. Just gone. It was harder to keep going after that. Every step felt heavier, every shadow seemed like it was hiding something. Even our conversations started to fade. It's hard to talk when you're too scared to make noise. That's when we found the church. It was this old, crumbling building on a hill, surrounded by overgrown weeds. It didn't look like much, but it had walls and a heavy door, so we decided to stay there for the night. That's where we found the second clue, an altar covered in symbols that matched the ones in David's book. The symbols on the altar were creepy, no doubt about it. They were carved deep into the stone, like someone had spent years making them. David said they were part of the ritual that summoned the darkness, but he didn't know how to reverse it. "There's a missing piece," he kept saying, flipping through the book like a madman. That night, we heard something new. It wasn't scratching or whispers this time, it was a voice. A deep, gravelly thing that echoed through the church, calling our names. We huddled together, too scared to move, while the voice circled the building. Then it stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. That's when the door started to shake, like something was trying to break it down. We held it shut, praying it wouldn't get in. Eventually, the banging stopped, but none of us slept after that. By now, it was just me, David, and a guy named Sam. We'd lost everyone else, some to the creatures, others to their own panic. The church felt like a tomb, and the air inside was getting colder by the hour. David finally found the missing piece. At the back of the book, hidden in a folded page, was a map. It showed a place far to the north, marked with the same symbols as the altar. "This is it," David said. "This is where it started." We didn't have a choice. Staying in the church was suicide, and going back the way we came was just as bad. So, we packed what little we had left and started heading toward the spot on the map. I don't think any of us really believed we'd make it, but we had to try. The journey north was brutal. The air felt colder with every step, and the darkness seemed thicker somehow, like it was alive and pressing in on us. Sam was the next to go. One moment he was walking ahead of us, holding the map, and the next, he was screaming. We found what was left of him a few minutes later. His body was there, but his face, it was like something had erased it, leaving only smooth skin. David threw up, and I wasn't far behind him. After that, it was just me and David. We didn't talk much, just kept moving, driven by some desperate hope that the map would lead us to answers, or at least an end to all this. When we finally reached the spot on the map, it wasn't what I expected. It was a cave, hidden behind a wall of jagged rocks. Inside, the air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the walls were covered in those same symbols we'd seen on the altar. At the center of the cave was a pedestal, and on it sat a strange object, a black orb that seemed to suck in all the light around it. "This is it," David whispered, his voice trembling. "This is what they used to summon the darkness." Before I could stop him, he reached out and touched it. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground shook, and a deafening roar filled the cave. David screamed, and the orb shattered into 1,000 pieces, releasing a wave of cold that knocked me off my feet. It all went down on a random Tuesday. No warning, no explanation, just total silence. Phones, TVs, cars, even the power grid, everything just stopped working all at once. At first, people thought it was some kind of blackout or a massive cyber attack. But as the hours dragged into days, we realized this wasn't something we could fix. The scariest part wasn't the darkness or the quiet, it was how fast everything fell apart. No internet meant no news, no coordination. Food ran out in stores within a week, and without electricity, water stopped flowing. Cities became wastelands. People turned violent, desperate. It wasn't long before the streets were filled with fires and screams. I was lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you see it. I was part of a small group holed up in an abandoned warehouse. There were 7 of us, people I barely knew but had to trust. We were scavengers now, trying to survive in a world that had gone dark. That's when the signals started. It was Pete who found the first one. He had this old, crank-powered radio he'd picked up while scavenging. One night, as we sat in silence, he started messing with it. Static filled the room at first, just a low hiss that seemed almost comforting compared to the silence. But then, we heard it. A voice broke through the static, faint but clear enough to send chills down my spine. It sounded like a woman, whispering a name, Elliot. Pete froze, his hand on the radio. "That's my mom's voice," he whispered, his face pale. "She died 5 years ago." At first, we thought it was some kind of sick joke or maybe just Pete losing it. But then more voices came through, each saying names or phrases that meant something to one of us. And the voices, they weren't just random. They were people we'd lost. People who were supposed to be dead. We didn't sleep much after that. Every night, the radio would pick up more voices, each more familiar than the last. It wasn't just whispers anymore, some of them laughed, cried, even begged. And the scariest part? They were calling us to come find them. The idea of leaving the warehouse was terrifying. Out there, the world was chaos, looters, wild animals, God knows what else. But the voices were relentless, and after a week of hearing my sister's voice calling my name, I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to figure out where this is coming from," I told the group. No one wanted to go, but they were just as haunted as I was. So we packed what little supplies we had, flashlights, knives, a couple of cans of food, and set off toward the one clue we had, the direction the radio's signal was strongest. The journey was worse than I imagined. Without working vehicles, we were on foot, trudging through ruined streets and overgrown fields. The cities were like ghost towns, eerily quiet except for the occasional sound of something moving in the shadows. Every night, we'd stop to rest, and Pete would crank up the radio. The voices never stopped. They seemed to know where we were, getting louder the closer we got. And the things they said, secrets only they would know, kept us going, even when our legs felt like giving out. By the third day, we were deep in the countryside. That's when the weird stuff started happening. Lights would flash in the distance, faint and flickering, like old fluorescent bulbs struggling to stay on. And at night, we started hearing footsteps outside our camp. But when we looked, no one was there. We found the first body on the fourth day. It was a man, slumped against a tree, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. His hands were clutching a small radio, the same crank-powered kind Pete had. It was still on, whispering something too faint for us to understand. "We should turn back," Sarah said, her voice shaking. But no one moved. We all knew it was too late to turn back. The voices wouldn't let us. That night, I dreamed of my sister, standing in the dark, her face half hidden in shadow. "You're so close," she said, her voice echoing in my head. When I woke up, Pete was gone. His backpack and flashlight were still there, but he was just gone. We searched for hours, calling his name, but all we found were his footprints, leading into the woods and disappearing. By now, it was just me, Sarah, and Liam. The air felt heavier, colder, like the darkness itself was pressing down on us. We stopped talking, too scared to draw attention to ourselves. Even the radio stayed off most of the time. But the signals didn't need the radio anymore. We started hearing them in our heads, faint at first, then louder. They weren't just voices anymore, they were images. Flashes of the people we'd lost, standing in the dark, their faces pale and their eyes glowing faintly. We finally reached the source of the signal on the sixth day. It was an old broadcasting tower, rusted and leaning, surrounded by a field of dead grass. The air around it buzzed, like static electricity, making the hairs on my arms stand up. "This is it," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper. The tower wasn't abandoned. As we got closer, we saw figures moving around it, slow and deliberate. At first, we thought they were people, other survivors, maybe. But as we got closer, we realized something was off. Their movements were too stiff, too unnatural. Sarah gasped, grabbing my arm. "Look at their faces," she whispered. I did, and my blood ran cold. They weren't faces at all, not really. Just blank, smooth surfaces where their features should have been. But somehow, they still turned to look at us. We ducked behind some bushes, too scared to move. The figures didn't come after us, though. They just kept circling the tower, their heads tilted like they were listening to something we couldn't hear. "What the hell is this place?" Liam muttered, his voice trembling. Inside the tower, it was worse. The air felt thick, almost impossible to breathe, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The radio signals were deafening now, a chaotic mix of voices, laughter, and screams. We found a room at the top filled with old equipment, radios, monitors, and wires that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. In the center of it all was a massive machine, humming softly and pulsing with light. This is what's causing it," Liam said, staring at it in awe. Before we could stop him, he reached out and touched the machine. The moment he did, the voices stopped. Everything went silent, so quiet it felt wrong. Then the machine flared to life, and the room was filled with blinding light. When the light faded, Liam was gone. The machine was still there, but now it was glowing brighter, and the air around it seemed to ripple like heat waves. "We need to leave," Sarah said, pulling at my arm. But I couldn't move. That's when I saw them, the figures from outside, now standing in the room with us. Their blank faces turned toward the machine, and one of them stepped forward, reaching out a hand. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted mix of every voice we'd heard on the radio. Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the stairs. We ran as fast as we could, the sound of the machine and the voices echoing behind us. I didn't look back, too scared of what I might see. We didn't stop running until we were miles away from the tower. By the time we reached an old barn and collapsed inside, it was morning, or what passed for morning in this dark world. The voices were gone, but so was Liam. Sarah and I never talked about what we saw in the tower. It didn't matter. The signals stopped after that, but the world didn't go back to normal. The power never came back, and the skies stayed dark. Sometimes, at night, I still hear the faint hum of static, like a radio tuning in. And I can't help but wonder, did we stop it, or did we make it worse? You ever get that feeling where everything seems fine, but deep down, you know something's wrong? That's how it started, small things, barely noticeable. An earthquake here, a volcanic rumble there. People chalked it up to nature, said the earth was just doing its thing. But it wasn't normal. Not even close. The first big one hit off the coast of Japan, a massive earthquake followed by a tsunami that wiped out entire towns. The news ran 24/7 coverage, showing horrifying footage of waves swallowing everything in their path. We thought it was a freak event, tragic but isolated. Then it happened again. And again. Within weeks, it was everywhere: South America, Europe, Asia. Fault lines that had been quiet for centuries started tearing apart. Volcanoes that scientists thought were dormant suddenly erupted with no warning. It felt like the earth was trying to shake us off, and honestly, maybe it was. It wasn't just the disasters that freaked people out, it was the patterns. At first, no one noticed because we were too busy trying to survive. But someone on the internet, before it went down, pointed out that the disasters were happening in a sequence. The earthquakes were following a path, moving from one tectonic plate to the next, like dominoes falling. And every time a major disaster struck, the death toll was staggering. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. It was like the earth wasn't just angry, it was hungry. I remember the night we realized it wasn't random. My buddy Jack had been tracking the disasters on a map, using an old atlas and pins. When he connected the dots, it formed a spiral. A perfect spiral, tightening toward a single point in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "Do you see this?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. We all leaned over the table, staring at the map. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing: this wasn't natural. That night, we heard the first reports about the strange sightings. Survivors from disaster zones claimed they saw shadows moving in the smoke and ash, shapes too big to be animals, too unnatural to be human. Some said they heard whispers, deep and guttural, echoing through the chaos. Most people dismissed it as stress or hallucinations. But not us. Not after what happened to Sarah. She was part of our group, and when the quake hit our city, she was the first to run. When we found her later, she was mumbling nonsense, her eyes wide with terror. "It's waking up," she kept saying. "We're feeding it." We tried to get her to explain, but she wouldn't, or maybe she couldn't. She just kept repeating the same thing over and over. "We're feeding it." The next morning, she was gone. Left a note that just said, "It's too late. I'm sorry." That's when we started hearing the rumors. People said the disasters were connected to some kind of ancient ritual. Sacrifices on a global scale. At first, it sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie. But the more we looked into it, the harder it was to deny. Every major disaster site had one thing in common: carvings. Strange symbols etched into rocks, buildings, even the ground itself. Symbols that weren't there before. Jack found pictures of them online: spirals, jagged lines, and something that looked like an eye, always staring. By then, the government had gone dark. No more press conferences, no more relief efforts. It was every man for himself. Our group decided to leave the city and head inland, away from the coast. But even in the middle of nowhere, we couldn't escape the signs. One night, while camping near an old quarry, we heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like something massive shifting underground. The ground trembled, just a little, and then we saw them. The carvings. They were glowing faintly, etched into the rock walls of the quarry. "What the hell is this?" Liam asked, his flashlight shaking in his hand. No one had an answer. But as we stared at the symbols, we realized they weren't just random. They were moving, shifting right before our eyes, forming new patterns. It felt like a warning, or a countdown. The next morning, the sky was a sickly shade of orange, like it was on fire. Ash fell like snow, coating everything in a fine gray powder. We tried to keep moving, but the air was thick and hard to breathe. That's when we found the first altar. It was in the middle of a clearing, a massive stone slab covered in dried blood. Around it were the same carvings, spiraling outward in intricate patterns. And on the slab itself was a single word, carved deep into the stone: awaken. We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. But as we left, we saw movement in the trees, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, but even then, we could feel them watching us. The further we went, the worse it got. More altars, more carvings, and more signs that something was waking up. The disasters weren't slowing down either. We heard distant booms, felt tremors under our feet. It felt like the whole world was collapsing around us. Then we met the old man. He was sitting by a fire, alone in the middle of the woods, like he'd been waiting for us. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, his voice raspy but calm. We didn't answer, but he just nodded, like he already knew. He told us a story, one that sounded too crazy to be real. About an ancient god buried deep within the earth, asleep for millennia. And now, through death and chaos, we were waking it up. "The altars are keys," he said. "Each one unlocks another piece of it." We asked him how to stop it, but he just shook his head. "You can't," he said. "It's been set in motion. The only question now is who will survive when it rises." He wouldn't say anything else, just stared into the fire, mumbling prayers in a language we didn't understand. We left him there and kept moving, though we had no idea where we were going. It wasn't like we could outrun it, whatever it was. But staying in one place felt like waiting to die. At least if we were moving, we had a chance, however small. That night, we heard the whispers again, louder than before. They didn't come from the ground or the air, they were inside our heads, a deep, guttural voice that felt ancient and endless. "Almost time," it said. "Almost free." The final quake hit on the 10th day. It was massive, splitting the ground open and swallowing entire forests. We barely made it out, running as fast as we could while the earth crumbled beneath us. When it stopped, we found ourselves standing at the edge of a massive chasm. And at the bottom of that chasm was the eye. It was impossibly huge, glowing faintly in the darkness, its pupil a swirling vortex of light and shadow. It wasn't fully open yet, but it was looking at us. We could feel its gaze, heavy and ancient, pressing down on our souls. "Run," Jack whispered. But where could we go? The earth itself was turning against us, and this thing, this god, was bigger than anything we could comprehend. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It was just waking up, and we were nothing to it. In the end, we didn't run. There was no point. We stood there, staring into the abyss, as the eye opened fully. The ground trembled, the sky burned, and the air was filled with a sound that was less a roar and more a vibration that shook us to our cores. Jack was the first to go, pulled into the chasm by an invisible force. Then Liam, then Sarah. I don't know why I'm still here, writing this. Maybe it hasn't noticed me yet. Or maybe it wants someone left to tell the story. If you're reading this, it's too late. The disasters weren't random, and they weren't natural. We weren't victims. We were sacrifices. And now, the god is awake. It started like a freak event, something that felt too surreal to be true. The meteor showers weren't anything new, we'd seen them before. But this time, they were different. The first few impacts weren't huge, just small bits of rock that barely made a dent. But then the big ones came, crashing into major cities like New York, Tokyo, and Paris. The destruction was unimaginable. The aftermath was even worse. The ground where the meteorites struck began to shift. Massive, jagged crystal structures erupted from the earth where the impacts had occurred. At first, scientists were intrigued, some new form of mineral, they thought. But when they tried to study the crystals up close, that's when things started to spiral out of control. I remember watching the news as they broadcasted footage of the first team that approached one of the crystals. The moment they got too close, there was a flash of light, and the entire team collapsed, as if their bodies had been drained of life. The crystals weren't just rocks, they were weapons. And they weren't from this world. People didn't want to believe it at first. Everyone kept hoping it was some kind of natural phenomenon, something that could be explained by science. But when more meteorites came, and more crystal structures appeared, it became clear this wasn't a freak accident. We were under attack. The crystals emitted a strange energy. It wasn't just deadly, it was suffocating. The closer you got to them, the more it felt like your life was slowly draining away. I watched as entire neighborhoods near the crash sites were evacuated, only to have the energy spread further. The cities became ghost towns, abandoned in a matter of days. And as the weeks went on, the crystals kept growing, spreading out like a disease. I met up with a few of my old buddies from college after we realized what was really happening. None of us knew what to do. How do you fight something you can't even understand? The government was no help, they were too busy trying to contain the panic, while the real danger was already here. And that's when we started hearing about the whispers. At first, we thought it was just paranoia. People were hearing strange noises near the crystals, soft hums, almost like voices, deep and vibrating in the air. But then, one of my friends, Mike, came to me with a recording. He had been near one of the largest crystals, somewhere in what used to be Berlin, when he caught something on his camera. It was hard to hear at first, just static and distortion, but then, in the background, a voice. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. But it wasn't just a voice, it was a command. In a language we didn't understand. The sound was so alien, it sent chills down my spine. Mike said he felt sick, like the energy from the crystal was speaking directly to his mind. He wasn't the same after that. Something in him changed, and not for the better. We started to hear more of these stories. People getting too close to the crystals, hearing these strange voices, and coming back, different. They weren't speaking normally anymore, or at all. Their eyes were vacant. It was like they were being controlled. And then we saw it, some of the crystals were moving. Shifting, rearranging themselves in ways that didn't make any sense. That's when the first contact happened. Not in the way we imagined, though. It wasn't a grand arrival or a ship in the sky. It came from beneath the earth. The ground near one of the largest crystal formations cracked open, revealing what looked like a giant structure, an alien ship, or at least the remains of one. It was buried deep, but the crystals seemed to be waking it up. The military tried to move in, tried to shut down the sites, but they couldn't. The energy from the crystals was too strong. Any attempt to destroy them was met with an explosion of light, and soldiers were vaporized before they even got close. We were no longer dealing with just rocks from space. These were beacons, sent to prepare the Earth for an invasion. The first wave hit within hours. Strange, mechanical creatures emerged from the cracks in the Earth, moving with purpose. They weren't like anything we knew, more like husks, robotic bodies controlled by the energy of the crystals. They moved with unnatural speed, and they didn't care who or what got in their way. Cities fell in a matter of hours. Our world had become theirs. In the chaos, we had to make choices. No one knew how to fight these things. Guns didn't work. The military was practically useless against an invasion that didn't follow any rules we understood. I stayed with Mike, trying to keep him sane, but every day, it was getting harder. The whispers were getting louder in his mind. He'd stare at the crystals, like they were calling him. We tried to escape, headed west, hoping to find some kind of refuge. But no matter where we went, the crystals followed. It was like they knew where we were, like they were hunting us. And the creatures, they weren't just roaming now. They were hunting, tracking survivors. Mike, he started acting strange. He kept saying he needed to go back to the crystals, that it was the only way to survive. It was like something inside him had changed, something we couldn't stop. He wasn't the same person anymore. He told me I didn't understand, that the whispers were calling, that they would bring salvation. But all I could hear was a voice, one I didn't recognize, telling him to return. Mike was gone. He disappeared in the night, running back toward the ruins of what used to be a city. I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. I don't know what happened to him, but when I got to the site, the crystals were glowing brighter than ever, and the whispers, they were louder. I could hear them, feel them. I don't know what happened to Mike that night, but I do know one thing, he wasn't the only one. People were drawn to the crystals like moths to a flame. Some would come back, different. They weren't speaking, or if they did, they didn't make sense. They would only stare at the crystals, like they were waiting for something. The rest of us, the ones who still had our minds, tried to regroup, tried to find some safe place to hide. But it didn't matter. The crystals were everywhere. They were spreading. And with every new crystal, the whispers grew stronger. We were being called, and I could feel it, our world was no longer ours. We were the last survivors of a planet that no longer belonged to us. I don't know how long we've been running. Days, weeks. Time doesn't mean much anymore. There are fewer of us left. Most of the survivors are scattered, trying to hide from whatever is left of humanity. We've all seen the changes, people taken by the crystals, their minds lost to whatever is controlling them. I tried to make contact with a few other groups, but they were all gone. It's like they were absorbed into the crystal network. No one's saying it out loud, but we all know it. We're being hunted. These things, these aliens, they're not interested in Earth's resources. They want us. They want our bodies, our minds. We're nothing more than hosts. Every night, I hear the whispers. I try to block them out, but they're always there, calling to me, pulling at my thoughts. I can't escape them, and I can't escape the crystals. We're running out of places to hide, running out of time. Whatever this is, it's only a matter of time before it's complete. Earth has been conquered, and we've become its prisoners. The next day, I woke up to the sound of screaming. It wasn't human, though. It came from the ground itself. I don't know what's happening, but the crystals are shifting, growing faster than ever before. The earth is trembling, and the creatures, those mechanical beings, are closing in. The whispers are louder now. They're in my head, telling me things I don't understand. It's not a warning. It's an invitation. Something is waking up, something inside the earth, and it's calling to us, calling to me. I can feel its presence, just below the surface. It's closer than ever. I don't know how much longer I have before the whispers pull me in. Before I, too, become part of their system. But if you're reading this, know this, our world is gone. Earth is no longer ours. It belongs to them now. And soon, it will belong to whatever lies beneath. I've stopped running. I can't anymore. Every step feels like it's taking me closer to something, to the crystals, to whatever it is that's controlling them. I can hear it, feel it, in the air, vibrating through my bones. The whispers are constant now, like a low hum in the background of everything. There are fewer people left. The world has turned into a war zone, a place where survival is no longer a choice. The crystals are spreading, and the creatures are getting stronger. There's nowhere to hide. I've seen people return, their eyes hollow, their minds lost. It's like they're being turned into something else. I don't know if there's any hope left, but I do know one thing: we've lost. The invasion has already happened. Earth is gone, and we're just waiting for it to be over. It's finally over. The last of us have fallen. The crystals are everywhere now, part of the earth itself. The creatures have taken over, and the whispers are gone. The world is silent. I don't know how it happened, but I'm still alive. Somehow. I feel different, though. The whispers have stopped, but the energy is still there, deep inside me. It's like I'm part of the crystals now, part of the invasion. I don't know if there's anyone left. Maybe there are survivors, somewhere, hiding in the dark. But it doesn't matter. Earth isn't our planet anymore. It belongs to them. To whatever is out there. And I've become part of it. It all started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The sun, our constant companion, began to dim. At first, it wasn't noticeable. Just a slight shift in the way the light felt on your skin. But over time, people started to notice the strange cold creeping in. The temperature started to plummet, and no one could explain it. The governments tried to calm the public with reassuring statements, but deep down, we all knew something was terribly wrong. The first signs of what was coming appeared in the cities. People were freezing, even inside their homes. Entire neighborhoods went dark as the sun refused to rise higher than a dull, blood-red disk in the sky. And then the nightmares began. Creatures, things from old stories that were supposed to be nothing more than myths, began to emerge from the shadows. The kind of creatures you'd read about in folklore books, the ones that parents used to scare their children with. The temperature kept dropping. Scientists said it was a global cooling event, but no one really believed them. People were starting to panic. It wasn't just the cold that terrified us, it was the whispers. Strange voices, echoing from nowhere. And there were sightings, too. People saw shadows moving in the dark, huge figures that didn't belong. Some said it was the wind playing tricks on their minds. Others weren't sure they would ever be the same again. As the world grew colder, we were forced to band together. A small group of us, determined to understand what was happening, made the decision to journey to the core of the earth itself. The theories were wild, but they seemed the only option we had left. The sun was dying, and we had to find the source of this unnatural darkness. We couldn't afford to wait any longer. We gathered supplies, and with every passing day, the frost crept deeper into the world. People were dying in their homes, victims of the relentless cold. The more we tried to move toward the Earth's core, the colder it became. It was as if the ground itself was rejecting us. But we pushed on, desperate to find answers. What awaited us below the surface, we had no idea. I remember the first time we felt it. The ground shook. Not like an earthquake, no, this was different. It was a deep, almost mournful tremor, like the earth itself was groaning. That's when we started to hear the voices. Low, guttural sounds, like something was calling to us from deep underground. No one spoke for a long time after that. We all knew that whatever was down there, whatever had been awakened, it wasn't anything human. We had to descend through caverns that no one had ever seen before. The air was thick and suffocating, like something ancient was pressing down on us. The further we went, the colder it got. But there was something more to it now, something wrong. The darkness in those tunnels wasn't just the absence of light, it felt alive, as though it was watching us, waiting. By the time we reached the first chamber, it was clear that something was very, very wrong. The walls of the cavern were covered in strange, glowing symbols that made no sense, yet felt familiar, like they were part of something older than time itself. We didn't know it at the time, but this was just the beginning. This place, this hollowed-out part of the earth, had been waiting for us. That's when we first saw them. They weren't quite human. They didn't look like anything we had seen before. Huge, towering creatures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift and melt before our eyes. I thought I was going to pass out from fear. But we had no choice but to press forward. The whispers were growing louder, and we realized that whatever had been awakened was more powerful than we could comprehend. We tried to communicate with the creatures, but it was pointless. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air itself seemed to carry their message, a cold, suffocating presence that made our skin crawl. The further we ventured into the heart of the earth, the more we realized we were not alone. We were being watched by something far older, far more ancient, than anything we had imagined. Then, one by one, our group started to lose its members. At first, it was just small things, someone disappearing without a trace, a faint scream in the distance. But as we ventured deeper, it became clear, these creatures were hunting us. One by one, they picked us off, silently, swiftly, without mercy. Our numbers dwindled. What terrified me most wasn't the monsters, it was the feeling that they were somehow waiting for something. We found a massive chamber deep beneath the surface. In the center of it was a giant, pulsating mass, like a heart, but made of shadows and cold. The creatures stood around it, almost reverently. It was then we realized this was the source. This was what had caused the sun to die, what had brought forth the endless darkness. We had walked straight into the heart of their world. It wasn't until we tried to leave that we truly understood how deeply we had underestimated this place. We had thought that somehow, by reaching the core, we would find the key to fixing everything, to restoring the earth to its former state. But no, the moment we tried to escape, the ground shifted beneath our feet. The walls closed in around us. The creatures were upon us in an instant. Their hands, no, their claws, were like ice, freezing everything they touched. I watched as one of my closest friends, Jessica, was pulled into the shadows, her screams fading into nothing. I couldn't even move, my body frozen in place by a primal fear that paralyzed me. This wasn't just an invasion of the earth, it was the end of everything. We ran, or at least tried to. But the path we had taken was no longer there. The tunnels had changed. We were lost, trapped in a labyrinth of darkness, where every turn brought us closer to the creatures, closer to the mass at the center of it all. And the whispers, oh God, the whispers. They were louder than ever, clawing at our minds, pulling us toward the inevitable. We were all going to die here. Alone, in the dark. The temperature had dropped so low that I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. It was like the life was being drained from my body with every breath I took. We were running out of time, out of options. The creatures were getting closer, and there was nowhere left to hide. We had walked into a trap, and now we were paying the price. And then, as if from nowhere, the ground trembled again. But this time, it wasn't the creatures. It was the heart. The massive, pulsating mass at the center of the chamber was growing stronger, its darkness spreading, pushing outwards like a wave. It was as if the earth itself was bending to its will, becoming a part of it. We realized, too late, that we weren't just fighting for survival anymore, we were fighting for the soul of the planet itself. I tried to call out to my remaining companions, but their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They weren't the same. The darkness had already begun to take them. The whispers had already claimed their minds. I was the last one standing. And in that moment, I knew that even if I managed to escape, nothing would be the same. The earth was already lost. The ground shifted again, and this time, it was different. The very walls of the cavern seemed to be alive, reaching out for me, grabbing at my legs, my arms. I was barely able to keep my footing, stumbling toward the surface, knowing that every second I stayed down here brought me closer to becoming one of them. One of the creatures. As I reached the surface, the sky was even darker than before. There was no sun now, no light, just an endless void. The whispers were still in my head, louder than ever. I had escaped, but what did it matter? The world had changed. The creatures were still down there, and the earth was no longer ours. It belonged to something ancient, something far older than we could comprehend. I realized then that this wasn't just the end of the world. It was the beginning of something else. The earth was dying, yes, but something far worse was coming to take its place. I thought I could outrun it, but I couldn't. No one could. The darkness was here to stay. The days blurred together as the temperature continued to plummet. The whispers never stopped. I could feel them, those things, out there, watching, waiting. The creatures were getting closer. I could see them in the corners of my vision, lurking in the shadows. There was no escaping them now. They were everywhere. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe it wasn't the cold that was killing me, it was the isolation. The silence. The sense that the world was no longer mine, that the creatures were closing in. The last remnants of humanity were scattered, hiding in fear, but I knew, deep down, that we were doomed. The earth had already been claimed by them. And we the last humans, were just waiting to be taken. Just waiting to become part of the darkness. I stopped caring about survival after a while. There was nothing left to fight for. The world as we knew it was gone. The sun was dead, and in its place, a never-ending night had fallen. The creatures, the darkness, had taken everything. We were just the last flickers of a dying flame. Some days, I'd hear a faint cry in the distance, a last attempt from someone else, somewhere, trying to survive. But I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. There was no going back. The creatures were here to stay, and we were nothing but their prey. I walked through the ruins of the world, knowing that I was the last to witness the fall of mankind. And I realized there was nothing left. The earth had already surrendered. Now, all that's left is the silence. The cold. The endless darkness. There are no survivors, no heroes to save the day. Just the creatures, and the whispers. I'm not sure if I'm still alive, or if I'm just a ghost walking through the remains of a world that no longer exists. But I know this, we didn't lose to a single enemy. We lost to something far worse, a force so ancient, so powerful, that even the earth couldn't fight it off. The creatures are still out there. And we, humankind, are nothing but a memory now. The sun is gone. And with it, all hope.